Good morning and welcome to the third meeting in 2026 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have one public item on our agenda today, which is to take evidence from two panels of witnesses on the Scottish Budget 2026-27. For the first panel, we hear from the Scottish Fiscal Commission. I therefore like to welcome to the meeting Professor Graham Roy, Chair, Dr Eleanor Ryan, Commissioner, Justin Riccomini, Commissioner, Claire Murdoch, Head of Fiscal Sustainability and Public Funding, and Michael Davidson, Head of Social Security and Devolved Taxes. And having read that list out, I think our time's just about up. But before we move on to questions, I'd like to invite Professor Roy to make a short opening statement. Good morning.
Thank you, Leader, and thank you for the invitation, Committee, to come back and give evidence to you. What I want to do is just provide a brief overview of our outlook for the economy, our forecasts of tax and social security, and our assessment of the funding and spending context for the budget. Our publication comes once again against an ongoing picture of global economic uncertainty. This has been a theme, as you know, within our previous reports, and it continues to affect our latest outlook. Overall, our forecast of the Scottish economy is broadly similar to last December, with a small downward revision to GDP growth next year from 1.5% to 1.3%. Income tax is forecast to continue to make a positive and growing contribution to the Scottish budget, but within that overall trend there have been a few updates. Firstly, the latest projections of the income tax net position are now more positive for 2024-2025 and 2025-26 than we set out in our most recent forecast in June last year. This is largely because of lower than expected UK data, reducing the forecast BGA in those years. Secondly, and in contrast, the projected net tax position in 26-27 has been revised down, this time as a result of more optimistic forecasts for UK earnings from the OBR. Based on the OBR and our latest forecasts, a positive net income tax position of £969 million is projected. How the income tax net position evolves not only affects funding through the revenues expected each year, but also through the projected reconciliations. We've seen a change in the latest projection for the 2027-2028 reconciliation. The committee will recall that we had highlighted the possibility of a large negative £851 million reconciliation for that year. As a result primarily of changes in UK data, this is now projected to be negative £310 million. We forecast social security spending of £7.4 billion next financial year. Since June last year, the difference between spending on social security and the block grant adjustments has narrowed from £2 billion to £1.2 billion for 2029-2030. Again, this is largely because of UK government changes, with the reverse of the planned restrictions to PIP eligibility, increasing BGA funding. On top of this, the removal of the two-child limit in universal credit and resulting cancellation of the Scottish Government's two-child limit payment reduces spending. We've also reduced our forecast for adult disability payment. The main factor in this reduction is lower than expected authorisation rates for new applications. The Scottish Government is balancing funding across the spending review using borrowing, the Scotland Reserve, Crown Estate revenues and a transfer of some funding from resource to capital. Despite this, the funding position remains tight. Resource spending is set to grow by an average of 1.1% after adjusting for inflation over the next 5 years and each of the next 5 years. Although the Scottish Government's decision to reduce the capital funding position in 25-26 leads to a real-term rise in funding next year, the spending review outlines real-term cuts to the capital budget in all future years. The spending review shows how health and social security spending will see the largest real-term increases, but resource funding to local government is falling as a share of the budget over the spending review. Finally, we highlight some risks within the spending review. The Scottish Government has identified £1.5 billion of efficiency savings to be delivered over the next 3 years. Delivering on these savings will be key to ensuring that the spending allocations set out in the budget are deliverable. On pay, the spending review allocations for portfolios are underpinned by below-inflation pay awards of 1.1% in 2027-28, as well as targets to reduce the size of the workforce. Of course, as pay is higher than assumed or workforce reductions are less than planned, the pay bill will be higher. And to end on a technical but important point, in our report we present resource spending in 25-26 as a position at the autumn budget revision, but removing routine in-year transfers which have not been baselined. while the Scottish Government have baselined £786 million of spending, which was not transferred, which was transferred between portfolios of the A25-26 ABR, there remains £606 million, which was not baselined. We continue to recommend that all routine budget transfers should be contained from the outset in the spending portfolio to which they will ultimately move.
Thank you. And in fact, I'm just about to start on that last point that you raised, which is the transfers. And I'm just wondering, you know, has the Scottish Government explained to you why they have transferred 786 million but not 606? Because it seems to me either you put everything in terms of the autumn budget revisions or you don't, because what we have is a kind of mixed picture and it makes it very difficult to do comparisons. So has there been an explanation? No doubt we'll put this to the CABSEC, but I'm just wondering if there's been an explanation to yourself as to why this kind of, you know, rather odd position has transpired.
So I think the first thing I would say is, so it's a step forward. So when
indeed, we've been calling for it for years in this committee. Yeah.
Yes, but I think the general point is it's one step rather than going to the end. And I think from our perspective, it would seem it's work in progress. And I guess we would always recommend, as I said at the end there, that where routine transfers are going to take place, then it makes sense and it's important that these are then allocated into the year that they would be. And that's why we made that adjustment to the 25-26 to make sure that the comparisons and growth rates are as accurate as possible.
Because it makes it difficult for people to actually do comparisons year on year, and I think that's certainly a concern for this committee and for anyone who might want to actually look at the figures. Now, obviously, I think one thing that stands out is the difference in terms of the reconciliation. I mean, it's more than £500 million of a change. And you did touch on it being on the kind of reasons for that, but you only did touch on it. I'm just wondering if you can go through, although it's in your report, a wee bit more depth for the record.
Yeah, so I might, I'll just go briefly and then maybe Eleanor might want to come in on this as well. So if you look at figures 4.7 and then figures 4.8 in our report, we set out how the reconciliations have evolved since we first made the forecast back in December 2023. And what's quite interesting on this occasion is that on balance we haven't really changed our forecasts for income tax in a really significant way. What's happened and what's moved around much more is the block grant adjustment. So the forecasts that the UK government were making, sorry, the OBR were making for the equivalent performance in UK taxes. And that's largely just data revisions coming through. There was data coming through at the UK level which would suggest that UK income tax receipts were growing much more rapidly than had thought. So that's why in the publication last year you had quite a significant change in the reconciliation, because the BGA was now expected to be much higher. That then remained high in June, but new data that's come out since then has brought that right back down again, and that's why we're now projecting a reconciliation of just over 300 million. So it's actually largely within the fiscal framework. It's the UK element that has been the driving factor about how that BGA has been evolving.
Okay, thank you. Now, another thing you talked about when you were in your opening statement was social security, and in paragraph 5.6 you say the number of people receiving PIP in England and Wales increased by 45%, while the number of people receiving ADP and PIP in Scotland increased by 57%. So I'm just wondering why that is, because what we see in figure 5.7 is that adult disability payments are rising very significantly from 25-26 to 26-27 by some £452 million, which is around 12% a single year. So why do you think there's a difference between the rates in the two countries?
So as you'll recall, one of the things that we've spoken about on several occasions is that the new system of delivering these payments has been designed to be more inclusive and more supportive for applicants coming in to receive these payments. Yep.
More on that, though, you go on to say in 5.7, you know that there's been a decrease in authorisation rate for new applicants from over 50% in 2023 to below 35%, whereas in England it's 45%. Yep. So it looks as if fewer people are actually getting this payment, and yet the numbers are still going up quite significantly. Yep. It seems to me that seems kind of almost anomalous. One would expect it to be below the English figure, given the authorisation rate's lower. So yep. It's that kind of. I'm just wondering how all that transpires. And we're talking about a difference of potentially some 35,000 people, you know, if it would the same rate of increase as we have in England. So it would be 35,000 fewer people on this benefit.
Yeah, so there's two things going on here. So one is, as I was saying, that the new system is designed to be more supportive and inclusive. We projected that would lead to more people moving into adult disability payment relative to what was in PIP, and that's what the 35,000 number estimates, that relative to when ADP was started, relative to now, compared to PIP, we estimate there's about 35,000 more people on ADP than would have been under the old system under PIP if those trends had continued. So that's the first point. The second point is that you'll recall that we were suggesting that number might continue to increase over the next few years. But one of the things we've seen relative to last year was, while we're seeing many more applications, the authorisation rate, so the success rate of those applications in Scotland has fallen significantly, and that's the figure 5.3 that you see there. And what's quite interesting is that when ADP was really coming on stream and ADP was first being rolled out, the authorisation rate was around about 50%. So about 1 in 2 people applying for the payment were successful in receiving the payment. But as you see from that chart, that's fallen significantly, now down to below 35%. And that is now lower than the UK PIP payment.
Any more applications in Scotland that it still means there's a significant increase?
Yeah, well, there's so many more applications early on and a high authorisation rate. But what we're now seeing is still higher applications, but an authorisation rate, a success rate that is low, and it's low historically, and it's low relative to the rest of the UK. And I think that's one of the really interesting things that we're seeing in the data, where we're now essentially seeing 2/3 of people applying for ADP are not successful, and only 1/3 are. And that's one of the things that we highlight in our forecast, is saying, well, if that continues and that's happened, fewer people will be flowing in than we forecast. But it also raises an interesting question about, is that what the government are expecting to happen with ADP, that 2/3 of people applying are not successful and only 1/3 are successful, and what's the long-term trend in that? So that's one of the risks that we highlight from the public finances about where that might move.
I mean, you're still predicting something like a 55% increase in the amount of benefit that will be spent in adult disability payment over the next 5 years to some £5,308 million by 2031. Are people really getting that more? Are there going to be so many more people with disabilities in the next 5 years, even with an ageing population? Surely it's not ageing that rapidly. We're not all disintegrating quite that quickly, are we?
Yeah. But I mean, this is a trend that you see across the UK. And again, so the key thing for the budget, of course, isn't just how the trend in Scotland, it's the trend in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. And it's a UK trend of inflows into disability payments that have been happening over time. And the other thing, which again is a cause of concern more from a policy point of view, is if you look at the inflows into child disability payment are significantly higher than historically been. And that then suggests that potentially people who are on child disability payment might spill over into adult disability payment, and that might continue to rise over time.
Okay, thank you. Now, you've talked about, again, in your opening statement about the £1.5 billion savings identified, and you talk about the majority being achieved through the health and social care portfolio, and you go through some of the annual savings predicted. But you go on to say that the recent Audit Scotland report in the NHS noted that while progress was made in 24-25, just 2 territorial boards and 3 national boards achieved the 3% recurring savings target. So how confident are you in terms of your forecasting that these targets will indeed be met?
Yeah, so maybe, Eleanor, do you want to come in and
happy to do so, yes. So we don't really forecast that target will be met. That isn't part of what we do. But we have highlighted that for the government to live with the spending plans they've set out across the spending review period, they'll have to deliver on these savings that they've set out. And that's undoubtedly going to be challenging. All the different elements of it, the workforce reductions, the other efficiencies. So I think the focus needs to be on how successfully those plans are delivered. It's very positive that the government have set out plans now, but can they follow through and show how that they're actually meeting those?
Okay, thank you for that. Now, one of the issues, obviously, that many colleagues will no doubt want to touch on is pay policy, and paragraph 50 I find quite interesting. You talk about and again you talked about this in your introduction. You talked about for the Scottish Government to set a spending review based on existing 3-year public sector pay policy, and there need to be an average pay award of 1.1% in 27-28 to complete that. And there seems to be no apparent change in the government's approach to this, even though quite clearly 1.1% will not be deliverable. I don't think anybody believes that. But he also said for the majority of NHS workers require a pay award of 0.78%, and we all know that's not going to happen. So again, how does this actually work in terms of your forecast? Because you've said for the purpose of our economy and tax forecast, we assume pay awards in 27-28 equal inflation. So you're basically just saying we know the government's not going to meet that, so our forecasts are just going to be what we believe the rate of inflation to be.
It's perhaps not exactly the way I would characterise it, but yeah, so you're entirely right. If the government stick to their pay policies based on the pay awards that have gone already, that suggests exceptionally small pay awards in the final year of the pay policy, and essentially real terms cuts in pay. So that's obviously the government haven't moved from that, and that's their position that has underpinned the allocations within the portfolios. On our basis, to give the most accurate forecasts for income tax and for the economy, we have to make a judgment about what we think is the most likely to happen. So on that basis, we decided to use our own forecast and return to our baseline for pay awards in the public sector, rather than use the government's projected pay awards. Because two things: one is we think that's a risk, and two, that we know that the government has said they'll revisit that for the budget in 27-28, and we therefore have used our baseline assumption rather than the current pay policy. Okay, now just to jump back to income tax. I like to jump about, as you know, keeping your toes and all that kind of stuff, but I know you know this all inside out. Behavioural change. So if we look at page 98, there's look at the freeze and the higher rate threshold in 27-28 and 28-29. You talk about behavioural change. So, for example, it's 10 million in 27-28, goes on to 20-21, 22 million pounds. And then you compare that to the static forecast. Now, this behavioural change, last year I understood the behavioural change of this tax was, correct me if I'm wrong, about 83% of the tax lost as opposed to what the forecast might be. So I'm just wondering, is this behavioural change on top of that? So effectively what you're looking at is a cumulative behavioural change. This only looking at the fact that it's been frozen, but what I'm saying is I'm not really seeing the big picture of the impact of this tax overall, or are you saying that we've already baked that in? So this is just about the impact of the decisions at the budget, the draft budget last week. So I'll maybe just say two quick things, and then Justine might want to come in on the overall point about behavioural change. So I think I need to come back to the specific 83% number you're using. I wonder whether that relates more to the upper rate. So there's a difference between the really top rates, where we think that there's the behavioural change is a significant proportion of the static cost, because that's the people who have the flexibility. Yes, indeed. The higher rate taxpayers is much lower down the distribution, and that involves many more people on salaries and employment, and public sector workers as well. So there's less flexibility in that. So we expect less behavioural change there. Yeah, it's the upper rates, yes, indeed. Yeah, so that's where you get much higher behavioural change there. On the point about, the bit that comes into it, what we do in each of the modelling is that essentially what we do is we start again. So when the government announces a policy, we model the new policy and then estimate the behavioural change that goes into that. What we don't do is estimate, well, what's the entire behavioural change that has come through all the cumulative policies. That's the sort of thing that gets captured more in that tax-based performance gap rather than... It's just if you were to do that, it would give you an overall view of, well, this tax is meant to raise 100 million, but only raises 10 million or 20 million or whatever it happens to be. If you're only looking at the changes, then you could end up in a situation where the cumulative change, the behavioural changes, are more than the actual tax is intended to raise. And so I think you don't necessarily get a clear picture. No, and again, just to be so, what we do here is purely look at the tax policy change that's announced in the budget, and then look at the behavioural changes associated with that. if you're asking, what is the total behavioural change as a result of all the tax changes that the government have made over time, then no, we don't estimate that. That then gets into quite complicated about what is the counterfactual, what's the broader effects that are going on in the economy, what are the decisions, UK government policy that have an impact, etc., that all just get factored in. And that's where we have the other extreme in our analysis, which is this tax-based performance gap, which is essentially everything in the relative difference between Scotland and the UK.
Okay, thanks for that. Yes, Justin?
Thank you. I think the other difficulty with behavioural change just at the top end is around the relative visibility of it, because it's not necessarily that there isn't really very much data available on what people are actually doing in terms of their behaviour. It could be putting money into a pension, it could be deciding not to take a promotion or actually working less hours or something like that. But until you actually see the pay data come through on real-time information and in outturns, we don't really know how much less tax is coming through, and you can't really necessarily tell whether that's as a result of employers reducing pay or getting rid of people or whatever, or actually the individuals themselves making choices.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, just want to talk about capital. One of the things you've talked about is the fact that capital funding will fall in real terms between 25-26 and 30-31 by some 5%. But I'm just wondering what measure you're actually using in terms of that, because you're using the normal GDP deflator, or for example, using the building cost information service figures, because they're saying that there'll be a 15% rise in construction inflation over the next 5 years.
I knew you were going to ask this question. Yes, we are using the GDP deflator because that's the standard practice when we look at the public finances. And I know what you're going to say and that's again, this is conventional practice that when you do public finance accounts, you use the GDP deflator because it then provides consistency across the board. But you're entirely right. When you start to look at within portfolios, like the health portfolio, we know the health inflation index is quite different from that. And you're entirely, right. I think where you're going to go is that the construction price, the cost of construction is, looks quite different from the GDP deflator, particularly if you're accelerating capital expenditure into particular years, because then that pushes up the price, and then that potentially means that the effect, the spending power of that capital budget,
capacity in certain geographic areas and certain skilled areas, and that obviously has a distortive effect. But I'm just wondering, why would you stick to the GDP deflator on capital when you know that it underestimates the actual effect? So it's not going to be a 5% reduction in capital in terms of the amount of roads you're going to maintain or the number of new houses you're going to be able to build or whatever. It's going to be a lot more than a 5% reduction, is it not? What's likely to be?
I don't know. The reason we use, the short answer, the reason we use it is it's conventional practice, and it means that we're then consistent about comparing our numbers.
Practice is inaccurate, which, given that you're forecasting, and governments have to take decisions on these things. But it's a kidology if we all know it's factually an underestimate of the reduction in what the capital spend in terms of what it can achieve.
So, as I said, the reason we do it is convention, but it also then is consistency that then looks at, we're then comparing like for like, so we can see what's happening to the capital budget in health versus what's happening into resource budget, so that we're using the same deflator across the board. But it's interesting, I would need to double check.
I thought you could have used the GDP deflator for resource, and this, whatever it's called, building cost inflation service rate, or whatever it is, for capital, something that can be agreed. Because, we use capital and resource completely separate. The figures are separated out and your figures throughout. So it just seems to me that it would make sense to be able to use two different measurements.
Yeah, I think it's maybe something we can definitely take away and look at it in terms of... in terms of the nuances within how we might then talk about the spending pressures within capital, for example. I think in terms of our headline estimates and things, it's important we use a deflator for the consistency from a public finance point of view. But we can certainly use other numbers to then say, OK, this is the number here. But if you're then looking at spending pressures within particular elements of the capital budget,
because sorry, before you come in, I was just going to say, because I mean, sometimes what's the other way as well. I mean, I remember after the 2008 crash, one of my housing associations actually put in, was building houses, and the tender came in 16% below what they thought, because there was such a shortage of projects happening then after the crash that companies just wanted to stay in business. So they're effectively building things without making any profit just to keep, the company rolling forward. So it just seems to me that you'd be able to see what the clout of the government is or not, if you were able to measure it differently. I'm kind of labouring the point a wee bit. But
in a sense, I'm more than happy to have...
I think Eleanor wanted to come in.
Do you want to come in now?
Will you? Or
yeah, I can. No, go on. I think all the things that Graham has said about why we use GDP deflator, one of the reasons, of course, is that there are internationally accepted definitions. There are well-established sources for calculating it. I don't claim that it's the best or only measure of inflation for all purposes, and you're quite right that looking at capital, there are other ways you could look at it. But if we were going to start to base our analysis and our forecasts on another measure, we need to be very, very careful about ensuring that it's a well-understood, well-accepted and established inflation measure, because we need to do that to serve the committee well. But we could definitely, as Graham has already said, we could definitely look at doing some supplementary analysis.
I was just going to add, I think probably the key thing here is, even if you use the GDP deflator, it's still a challenging capital funding outlook over the next 5 years. And the government is doing things like using money from the Crown estate. They're planning to switch some funding from resource to capital, and you're still looking at a real terms cut using the GDP deflator. Obviously, if you used a different measure of construction costs, it would be even more challenging. And that tells you something about what you're looking at for infrastructure investment over the next 5 years.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to let colleagues in around the table. First will be Craig, followed by John.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Professor Roy. Just to go back to public sector pay for a moment, I think, by common consent, it seems to be an area where I think a red light is flashing at this point in time. What estimates have you made so far about forward-looking public sector pay deals? And does that give you any confidence that a 1.1% pay policy is going to be met now and into the future years?
So a couple of things. So what we've got is obviously the government's public sector pay policy, which is for up to 27-28. And the first thing I'd say is that we do highlight that as being a risk, because if you look at what the pay policy says, the 9% over the 3 years, what's left in that overall envelope suggests a real terms pay cut in the final year. So we highlight that as being a risk. And then it then means that if the actual pay policy differs from that stated bit, then that then means that within the portfolio allocations within the spending line, essentially more of that allocation has to go on public sector pay, which then means that the other aspects of the budget have to do the heavy lifting in order to make up the gap. So that's the first point. Then the second point is then what does that then mean for our forecasts? And that's where we think that, given what I've just said there and the history of where the government have moved on pay, we think that that's a significant risk to let us use a different forecast, which is a 2% forecast in terms of public sector pay. Now, what I would say in that is that we're not... that's not us saying that's what it's going to be. It's just saying that for our forecast purposes, then we go to our baseline, and our baseline is that public sector pay rises with inflation.
Other analysts in relation to productivity have said that, it would be heroic to meet the government's productivity targets in light of everything that's happening in the budget. It would be heroic negotiations for the Scottish Government to be able to go into a room with trade union officials based on recent experience and come out having negotiated a net real terms reduction in pay, presumably. That's not going to happen.
Well, it's ultimately a decision for the government and how they navigate through the discussions around public sector pay policy. Again, the general point we would highlight is that given recent trends, pay policy deals have been higher than what the trajectory would be for the overall envelope for public pay policy. So the government then have to manage that as a risk. We do discuss some of the other risks around public sector pay as well. So we talk about some of the issues around the kind of workforce job numbers. We talk a bit about the ongoing costs within the pay bill, so the drift in pay, and we've changed our assumptions slightly around that to factor in the fact that the government has said that they tend to they take more a significant management of the overall pay drift. So we've pulled down our forecasts on that as a result of the government's stated policies on that.
In paragraph 52, you say pay awards are higher than the Scottish Government assumed. To keep the pay bill at the levels used as the base of the spending review, the Government would have to make larger workforce reductions than it has already planned. The Government's already put quite a gutsy figure out in terms of public sector efficiency savings and workforce savings. What is the risk there that if they don't actually meet those projections to reduce the size of the civil service, and also public pay deals are higher than 1.1% and could be above inflation, where is the room? Where is the wiggle room within that? It strikes me there is none.
Yeah, well, and that, I guess, reflects in part the nature of the Scottish Government's budget, in that it is largely fixed, and so that, and with pay being around half of the budget in lots of portfolios, it necessarily means that if you have made your decisions on the assumption that your pay award next year, or sorry, 27-28, is going to be lower than inflation, and you're going to make significant savings in terms of public sector headcount and pull down on pay drift, if you don't meet any of these conditions, it then means you're going to essentially have to find the money from somewhere else. And that either has to be through increased revenues, so in hoping that the block grant might increase, or that you're going to increase taxation, or that essentially you're going to have to find that money within your existing spend. So you have to then save money from non-pay costs, which would be the delivery of services.
Is there also a risk in terms of the structure of the Scottish tax system now that as public sector workers are getting into the higher rates of tax, the trade union negotiators who negotiate on their behalf are going to be tougher because they effectively know that 50% of any pay increases are going to be handed back to the Scottish or the UK Exchequer in tax and national insurance? Yeah.
It's an interesting one. We make a general, I think we've made a general point of the last few days, and some of the conversations is that you see the change in the tax base in Scotland and the tax structure, about how that's done. So I think we talked about in 2016-17 about just over 300,000 taxpayers in Scotland being higher rate taxpayers. That's now, we project next year to be over 800,000. And if you look at full-time earnings within the public sector, full-time median earnings in the public sector, that's pretty much around about the threshold for higher rate taxpayers now. So you're right, is that as more pay awards come through, the government will essentially recycle some of that through higher taxes. And as you know, there's this quirk, Justine might want to talk about it a bit more, with the interaction with national insurance, which increase the marginal tax rate.
Yes, absolutely. It's 15%. It's not looking as if any policy from the UK government on that is going to change at any particular given time. We'll have to see, if there's an election or something that changes again. But for the time being, there is an additional 15% employers' national insurance on that pay bill. So the higher that pay rises, then, if you increase something by 1%, it's still increasing by more than if salaries were lower, obviously. So it's a difficult one.
You mentioned with the convener about behavioural change. What behavioural change do you think a £32 a year tax cut might affect in Scotland?
I think so. It'll all be modelled in our projections. So so the increasing the basic threshold by 7.4% in figure 8.2, The behavioural change is 1 million, and the intermediate rate is 1 million as well on behavioural change.
We've also discussed the fact that by freezing thresholds at the higher level, more and more people are being pulled into tax. That's now happening in the rest of the UK.
Yeah.
How does that compare with other kind of nations of our size and kind of net wealth?
I don't know off the top of my head. The one thing I would always caution about comparison with other countries is you have to look at the entire tax system, and you have to try to look at the entire public spending system and what you get. So the classic comparison would be is comparing something like the UK to Scandinavia, where they have much higher tax rates. They tax the tax base much more, so more broadly across, not just at the top end of the income distribution, but more broadly across the income distribution in general. But then in exchange for that, you have much higher levels of public investment, much greater social security, insurance, etc. So I think the challenge with trying to unpick one element of the tax system in the UK and then say, well, how does it compare to Norway or France or the US, is that you're always going to get a partial comparison that can be quite misleading.
But in terms of pulling more people into what is deemed upper rates of tax, is that a phenomenon that's occurring in other countries, effectively changing the profile of the taxation system?
Yeah, I mean, in general across, I would make a general point about taxation across that, and then Justine might want to come in and speak with that. But if you look in general across most countries, then the tax base is rising over time, and that comes back to some of the stuff we've spoken about around demographics, and that as a result of that, then you have higher rates of tax relative to what was done historically, because you have an ageing population. But Justine, I don't know if you want to come in on...
Yeah, all I was going to say was to kind of reinforce what Graham was saying about looking at the whole picture, because in each country, you know, you could be in Switzerland where you might pay a different rate of tax, income tax, depending on which region you actually live in Switzerland. But actually what we have to look at as well is the amount of tax reliefs that there are in connection with earning that income. So, you know, I do remember when I worked at the Office of Tax Simplification that there was probably about 1,050 different reliefs. So we were trying to simplify that, which was a bit like telling the sea not to crash onto the shore. But, you do have to look at everything in the round. But generally speaking, more people do seem to be being brought into tax across the globe.
Obviously, kind of the interface between earnings growth and the tax take is interesting. You're projecting slightly lower earnings growth in Scotland than the rest of the UK, and it's being downgraded. What impact will that have moving forward effectively on the Scottish budget?
Yeah. So a couple of things I would say. So we've seen the net tax position become more positive over the last couple of years, and we've had the positive reconciliation which comes in this year's budget, because earnings growth in Scotland surprised on the upside relative to the UK. And that was some of the stuff we've spoken about before, about particularly some of the decline we'd seen related to the downturn in oil and gas in the North East, having an impact on higher earners, a disproportionate impact therefore in terms of Scottish income tax receipts. What we're seeing from the data so far this year is that relative performance of Scotland being ahead of the UK is actually disappeared, and now UK earnings growth is slightly higher than in Scotland. And the way the fiscal framework works is that all else remaining equal, so let's assume there's no changes in taxation, then the net tax position, Scotland will gain on the net tax position if our earnings grow faster than the rest of the UK. And if earnings growth in the rest of the UK go faster than Scotland, then that net tax position will weaken. And that's why you see the slight pull down in the net tax position for next year. Not really because we've changed our forecast for earnings, it's because the OBR have uplifted their forecasts for UK earnings quite significantly, and that then narrows the gap, and the net tax position isn't as strong.
Yeah. In his report to us today, David Heald, who will be giving Evidence Next, says that greater devolution of tax powers is actually increasing the risk in terms of the way in which it can have a net effect on Scottish revenues. Is that a fair conclusion?
I'm conscious David's behind me, so I'll choose my answer carefully. I mean, I think, but I've not read the specifics around that. I mean, I think the principle of that by tax devolution builds in risk. I mean, that was part of the whole rate. That was a part of the whole thing about moving into devolution and fiscal devolution, was that would now build in greater risk and reward, you could say, into the Scottish budget process. There's also a question about, have you got the balance right in terms of what risk you can control, what risk you can't control? Have you got the right tools to manage the risk? We've spoken before in the committee about things like the reserve and the limits on borrowing, and whether the limits on borrowing are sufficient to manage the reserve. But that's one of the reasons why we highlighted the potential for quite a large reconciliation coming, that actually was going to lie outside how much the Scottish Government could borrow to smooth that. So there's a question about risks, about how you manage the risks, as well as whether the risks are appropriate or not.
Another debate, obviously, that's about to be had is what the budget means for Scottish local authorities, with the First Minister urging councils yesterday to look at council tax increase potentially of 3%, and we know from speaking to councils that some are looking at 8% and upwards of 10%. Having delved into the figures, what is the real terms position for council budgets next year and into future years?
Yeah, so this is one of the challenges in terms of how the government present the figures and how they do it, and also then the level of information that then comes out afterwards. So we have on figure 2.8, we show the real terms change in the local government budget between this year and next year, once you've adjusted for all the transfers. And we think that is a real terms increase of 0.4%. And then if you then look over the course of the spending review, then on figure 2.10, we have a reduction in real terms of the local government budget of close to 500 million over the up to 28-29.
The Finance Secretary said last week that they were looking at 2% year-on-year increases in real terms. Where would that figure come from?
Yeah, so I don't, that's not our number. So I have to ask the Cabinet Secretary on that. I mean, I think this comes back to the point about what's your baseline that you're comparing. So if you, for example, you can be comparing budget to budget, which might be where the 2% figure comes from. So what was stated in the budget allocation in December 2024 versus what was stated in the budget position last week. I think the one why we publish our estimate is that we know that routine transfers take place. So therefore, we adjust for the routine transfers, and that's where we get the 0.4% as being one that we think is like-for-like comparison.
So when councils say that they're potentially going to have to increase council tax and the government says they're not, you're quite clear in saying that there is a real terms cut coming to council budgets in 28-29, was 27?
That over the course of the spending review,
yeah.
By the end of that period,
Yeah.
then in real terms, yes, the current plans will have the local government budget being cut.
Fine. And just finally, one question in relation to business rates. I think we were talking earlier about reliefs being baked into a system of tax. It strikes me that with all the reliefs in the business rates area, non-domestic rates at the moment, perhaps the whole system needs to be looked at. But obviously we've got the situation of this rates revaluation coming through. We've got a number of transitional reliefs and the small business bonus scheme, and then specific reliefs for hospitality. Have you been able to estimate how many businesses in Scotland are going to be better off or worse off as a result of the proposed revaluations and then subsequent reliefs? And is there any specific sectoral or size of business that is exposed potentially to higher non-domestic rates bills? Because obviously all of us are hearing that hospitality, leisure and retail are potentially being hit through the revaluation, while the government are saying they've now brought forward reliefs. But who are going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers?
I mean, Justine might want to come in on some of the specifics on that. I mean, in general, we don't go down to that level of detail because what we're looking at is the overall funding position. So taking the thing that you have a revaluation, which is designed to be broadly revenue neutral, and then it's up to really the government to then manage about who gains from that and how you work through the appeals and all of that. So we don't go down to that level of detail, looking at it geographically or within particular sectors in any significant way. But Justine or Michael, do you want to add anything further to that?
No, that's right. We don't go down to that level of detail, but you're right that the area of reliefs in total, I think in our supplementary tables we publish, in 26-27, the total value of all reliefs comes out 864 million. So it is quite a lot in the forecasting process to look at, but as Graham says, we just sort of look at it on aggregate.
The additional reliefs announced in the budget relative to the proposed increase, my understanding is there's still quite a significant shortfall in reliefs as opposed to what will be brought in through this potential revaluation, if indeed it goes ahead. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's correct. So you mean the year-on-year increase?
Yes.
So the year-on-year increase, I don't have the figures to hand, but it's still, I think, the policy costing takes that we've done for the reliefs that are added takes a reasonable amount on that, but there is still a step up, and that's in part because then in future years we don't forecast revenue to continue to increase because of appeals then erode the value of the role. So there's always that after the revaluation, a sort of step up and then levelling off, and then I think it's 2029 when the next one would come up, we'd anticipate another step up and then levelling off.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. John, to be followed by Liz.
Thanks so much, Convener. I mean, inflation has been mentioned already, but we had the OBR in, and I think they were accepting that they'd been a little bit optimistic about inflation coming down quicker than it has, but they still seem to be quite optimistic it would keep coming down. Are you broadly in agreement with that?
I think so. In general, because we know that the bank have the remit to put inflation to target, then we assume that they will get back to that. I think what's happened over the last year has been, again, the constant shocks that you would see this time. The shocks have been in the upside. So we have the energy price change, we have food price inflation, we have global instability has meant that world inflation hasn't come down, which has had an impact on food prices. So that's why we've revised up our forecast there. In terms of the budget, what the material effects of inflation are, I guess, comes back to that conversation about the erosion of the spending power of the government budget, but then also the protection then comes through on things like social security, where the benefits are uprated across the UK with inflation, which then feed through to the BGA. So the effect of inflation is really just to remove the spending power of the government, but there's a protection there in terms of the social security uplift.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned global insecurity and amongst that, and that is a bit unpredictable. Well, certainly I think it's unpredictable. I mean, in principle, if tariffs are brought in by countries, does that increase inflation, or does it just depress imports?
Yeah, so in aggregate, yes, then tariffs would be inflationary, on balance, they would be inflationary increasing, and also economy dampening, so you would have potentially stagflation in that regard, as the first instance. Of course, it then works out the specifics and all of that about what sectors are particularly targeted, but tariffs, by increasing the price on imports, would lead to, if we put tariffs on, for example, that would lead to higher inflation as a result of that. And then if other people put tariffs on our exports, that would lead to weaker growth.
Thank you. I think, like the convener, I'm jumping around a bit. The Scottish Spending Review, I think it's the IFS, said that it's a bit, not that it's vague, but that there could be big changes potentially. I mean, it's not set in stone, obviously, and it's subject to lots of things happening that would change it. So, I mean, how much confidence should we put in the Scottish Spending Review?
So I think there's a couple of things. So the fact that they've done a spending review is a step forward, and the fact that they've now given allocations for spending for the next 3 years is more than we've had in previous years. I think, again, back to the point about things like revisions within years, they haven't gone down into different levels there, so they basically stop at level 2, and they don't always split it out between revenue and capital. So the level of detail that I think you would want to know about what's happening, say, to the individual enterprise agencies, or what's happening to the overall higher education or further education budget, that level of detail isn't there. And also, I think the other bit is the portfolio efficiency savings. How do they link in explicitly to what the government spending allocations have looked like? So I think the fact that we've now got data for the next 3 years is helpful, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions about how all this adds up and what the genuine plans are.
Should we be pressing for more detail?
Well, you'd expect the answer from us always being yes, more detail, the more detail, the better. Yeah.
And on the other one, the investment, I keep forgetting what it's called, infrastructure delivery pipeline, we've got this split between delivery and development. I don't know if you were expecting that. I hadn't realised that was going to be the way they did it. But again, you know, is there enough detail in that, or should we just be glad it's a step in the right direction?
I don't know, Justin, you want to come in on that? I mean, I think it's a step forward, the fact that we now have a plan which the committee have been asking for several for a wee while. I think the point is that what's the level of detail that do you have the level of detail that you can genuinely scrutinise what the government's priorities are, what they're planning to spend, and when. But I don't know where you want to maybe add anything further to that.
Thank you, Graham. I think in terms of the report itself, the interesting points are around Annex A and B, because they've set out what's definitely seems to be going to be happening in Annex A, because money's already been allocated and the work is underway, such as with the A9 and the prisons, for example, and there's also the peatland restoration programme. And in Annex B, we've got a situation where there's a list of items where they're developing a business case or an outline business case on those things. So we're not sure at the moment whether, you know, it's not particularly clear which of these will be actually included in a future spending review. So we can't really map it at all. So, and that is the case with Annex C, is that it's a pipeline decision-making process, but it doesn't contain any timelines or anything. No. So, obviously...
No, so especially B, I mean, well, they're approved in principle, but, I mean, might never happen. And, yes. I mean, even A, you said A was quite good, but there's no figures in A at all.
Oh, no, it's just a list.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, okay, well, I suppose it's a step in the right direction, as they say. Okay, again, jumping around a little bit. Landfill tax, quite a big drop in what we're expecting. I mean, I know it's not big money in the scheme of things, but down from 50 million to 27 million?
Yeah, so this is the ongoing, Michael, I don't know if you want to jump in on specific here. This is the ongoing, some of this is ongoing plans that the government are doing around how they're actually operationalising landfill and trying to disincentivise things going to landfill, and therefore you would expect the revenues to fall on that. So it's a success if you get less going to landfill, which in turn means you're receiving less tax revenues than that. But Mike, I don't know if you want to. Yes, yeah, we've talked about the BMW ban.
Yeah, so our forecast factors in incineration coming on stream before the implementation of the ban. So we've made a few adjustments to our forecasts such that I think in the absence, in the delay of the ban, had that not been the case, our forecast would be around 10 million lower in 26-27 had the ban applied, because obviously there's more waste can still go to landfill, so then the revenue is higher than it would otherwise have been. But then there's still incineration coming on stream before the ban applies, so then that's why it sort of gradually decreases.
Okay. So although it seems to be falling quite dramatically, it could have fallen more dramatically, potentially. Yeah. Yes, right. Okay. Now, council tax bans, we're getting 2 more bans, we believe. Not this coming year, I don't think. It sounds like the costs of that, of actually arranging this, are going to almost wipe out all the extra revenue. Is that correct?
So it's not something we forecast to look at because it's a local tax that lies outside our remit. So the only thing that we did was really look at whether we thought there was going to be an impact on LBTT. So that change behaviours there, and it was a very small effect that we would estimate. So yeah, so we don't unfortunately
look at that one. That's fair enough. No, that's fine. Now, preventative spend, we've been interested in this committee before, and I fully accept that it's quite difficult to pin down what is preventative spend and what is not. But there's this idea that the government's going to be tagging the preventative spend. Is that going to make a difference to the figures that we actually see, or would it be kind of an annex of things? Yeah. And does that affect your forecasts at all?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very long history to this, and I don't need to tell this committee about that. I think the key thing with preventative spend is to think about what is getting in the way of it at the moment? I mean, everyone has been talking about the idea, the concept's well established, the government welcomes it, I'm sure the committee does. What is it? What's the behaviour change that's needed in order to shift more money towards prevention, to ease pressures on services in the future? And one way of doing that might be having a category of spend or tagging the spend, or you know, the key thing will be to look at whether that's going to drive the behaviour change you want, and also if you're going to tag the spend, the really important thing will be then to follow that up and later on to evaluate what was achieved. So you tag that as preventative spend, fine. In 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever the time horizon is for that preventative spend, what did it deliver? And did that work? And therefore, what's the learning from that, and how you continue to drive the behaviours you want? It's always the follow-through part that is difficult.
It could be quite long term, as you're saying. It could be 10 years.
But it depends the nature of them. I mean, as you said, there are issues about what you define as preventative, and they go on different time horizons. But it should be possible.
From your perspective, is there agreement on what preventative spend is?
I think there's quite an extensive literature on preventative spend, and there are people who categorise different types of preventative spend. I think it's less about which definition you choose, but that everyone is clear which definition you're using, is probably what I would say.
Okay, thank you. Now, the UK, we believe, is moving towards just having the one budget event, one fiscal event every year, although the OBR will still have 2 forecasts every year, if I'm understanding it correctly. Does that have any impact on yourselves, any of that?
Not specifically. I mean, I think the fact that you will still need the BGAs to do the adjustments that happen through, etc., over time. I guess there's the broader answer I would say around the kind of the interaction with the UK budget and the Scottish budget still feels as though it could be improved in the context. So again, we had the relatively late UK budget, which then means that the Scottish budget is now pushed back into January, which then really squeezes the ability of the committee to scrutinise the budget. So it's less about the number of budget events, it's more the timing, I think, which is the key issue from a Scottish perspective.
Okay. And just Professor Heald was mentioned already, but I was interested in some of his input, and I'll probably ask him about it later on. But he talks about the different way that the UK can handle social security spending as compared to the Scottish government. And he talks about quasi-DEL. And I think that the idea that if the UK overspends a bit because it's demand-led, well, that's fine, they just borrow a bit more. But if we overspend, we've got a problem because we've got a fixed budget. Is that fair kind of comment?
Yeah, so it depends really. Michael wanted to come in this and declare as well on specifics or how it works in the technicalities. The key thing that I guess is that if Social Security increases within a year, what's the source of that increase? So is it a relative position compared to the UK, or is it that the UK is changing? Because then the block grant adjustment would change as well. So there's an acceleration. So this is a shared increase in Social Security. Then the BGA would increase, and that would help out the Scottish budget. But in general, where there's a relative difference in that, then the Scottish government essentially pick up the slack of that in terms of managing their budget. But I don't know whether anyone wants to
because of the borrowing powers they have through resource borrowing, which can be used for forecast error, that can be used for in-year management of that social security spending. It's more of an issue if you think about longer-term divergence between Scotland and the rest of the UK, then that's going to put additional pressure on the budget that's harder to manage in year.
Okay. Right, thanks, Convener.
Thank you. List to be followed by Michael.
Good morning. Could I ask about the prioritisation, or perhaps just as importantly, the deprioritisation of Scottish government spend? Because this is in relation to the paragraph 54 in the committee's report, where we said that we are seeking clarity on which areas of spending are being prioritised and deprioritised, and that was on the back of some of the comments from Audit Scotland, who were also looking for a bit more clarity on that. We've obviously got the bigger ambitions about tackling climate change, we've got tackling child poverty, we've got economic development, but it's very hard to see within the budget exactly which policies will deliver improvements in these areas And I just wondered if you agree with that concern, and if you do, what extra information you'd like to see from the Scottish Government.
So I know, Claire, we were chatting about net zero as well, and what was in the kind of climate stuff which has changed there, which might be quite useful. So a couple of things I would say that we've tried to do to try and help that. So what we've done for the first time is present tables of portfolio as a share of the Scottish Government's budget, which then shows essentially, arithmetically, what areas are being prioritised versus what areas are being deprioritised. So the overall budget is going up very slightly, but then you can look at, okay, within that overall increase, what's going to take on a bigger share of that? And then you see, unsurprisingly, the areas such as health and social care and social justice essentially taking up more of a share of the government. So that's the priority. I think then you see local government going down and education and skills going down as well. So in terms of a relative prioritisation within the overall spending envelope, you can see which areas at an aggregate level are being prioritised and that are less of a priority. So that's what we've tried to do to try and help on that regard. I guess the bit that I think that we'd like to see much more information on is around the detail within the spending review. So I've said it goes to level 2. It doesn't go to level 3, which is what the spending review I think in 2011 did. There isn't a split between revenue and capital. We've spoken about the capital pipeline not being in any detail. So you have a list of projects, but you don't know which ones are actually going to be delivered. And that's just on the allocations of spend. I think you then follow-up bit, which you can't then do even the next bit because you haven't done the first bit, which is, well, if you're doing all of that, what does this mean for your ambition on child poverty? Or what does this mean for your ambition on net zero? But you can't do that if you've actually not set out where the spending allocations have been in the first place.
Thank you for that. It's very helpful. I mean, the committee goes on in paragraph 62 to say that we're not convinced that the Scottish Government has set out sufficient evidence to support its argument that the future social security budget is sustainable. Now, while that's leading on to something slightly different, it's on the same theme because it's effectively saying that we do not have enough information available to provide the evidence that that social security budget, which as we know is increasing quite fast, will actually be sustainable. It's all part of the same thing, that there isn't enough detail. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the general part I'd make about, so the budget, in a sense, the social security budget is sustainable in the sense that the government have to pay for it. Is then the question about, well, how is that paid for elsewhere? We might come on to some of the revisions that have happened, which have actually changed the picture materially relative to June in narrowing that gap. I think the general comment then, though, is within each area, and within the allocation, so we say in figure 2.1 that the health budget is going to go up by just over £1 billion over the course of the spending review. I guess your question is, well, what are the outcomes that is going to achieve, and what's the evidence that the government have got that underneath all of that, the outcomes they want to have in terms of improving public health, in terms of tackling waiting time, delayed discharges, etc., are all going to be delivered by that spending allocation. Because we've got an portfolio efficiency plan, which talks on high levels about the efficiencies, but how do they speak to the spending allocation, and how do they then speak to the outcomes that's going? And that, I think, is a missing piece of the jigsaw, which isn't for us to do, but would be for the government to set out.
I think it's a very big missing piece of the jigsaw, because what effectively we're getting is information about the investment in Scotland in terms of social security spend. The Scottish Government tells us that the reason for the increase is that there's a future investment, which may go back to what you're saying about preventative spend. But what we're not getting is the detail about exactly how that is going to happen. That's the problem. In terms of the actual social security spend, we're not really sure which areas are having the best possible impact, for example, on child poverty, and which aspects of increased spending are actually almost having an opposite effect, that they're not providing the benefits. And I think that's quite a serious concern, because, again, the committee asked, we said that when it came to the medium-term financial strategy, we didn't feel that was giving enough information on that detail. Is that something that
Yeah, and I think you could extend that into, the good example of that would be the government statement around the 125 million of saving on the two-child limit and then being invested in child poverty reduction activities. I guess the question from your perspective of the committee would be is, you know, how do you follow the money to then say that this £125 million that you've saved is being allocated in the most efficient and effective way that then is based on the outcomes you're trying to achieve. That is not our territory for that. We just look at the overall public finances there, but that's certainly something that is not, you know, I think you could do more to set out the evidence base that is justifying why allocations are what they are.
Okay. And finally, on our recommendation in paragraph 73, we made it very clear that we wanted a debate on universalism as to some study of what universal payments are working best and which perhaps are not. And in return from the Scottish Government, there was an agreement that the economic and fiscal environment remains very challenging, and that means that we've got tough choices to make. But they go on to say that they're developing an approach to public value, and that approach will embed a framework for understanding the spending proposals in universal terms. Are you aware of what that framework actually is? What's happening in terms of measuring this public value when it comes to universal payments?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of it. I don't know whether Claire or any officials have any...
No, other than public value being one of the things they list as part of their efficiency plans in the spending review.
So, to your knowledge, just to be clear, there is no study or framework at the present that will investigate which universal payments are working most effectively and which are not.
Yeah, so not that we've seen. There might well be something the government are doing or working on developing, but it's not something that we've seen. I'm not sure whether we would see it in terms of would it have an, you know, why would we see it? So I guess the question for us would be: is it would have a material impact on our forecasts? Would it have a material impact on where justification was moving around some spending lines? So it would probably be something the government would work on themselves, and then we would see it as part of the package, a bit like the unpicking of the portfolio line.
Except the committee's asked for
yes,
that.
Yeah, you would ask for it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Michael, to be followed by Patrick.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. A few points of clarity perhaps you could help me with. First of all, the changes to council tax, commonly referred to a mansion tax, will the benefit or uplift from that, will that accrue to local authorities or will that be banked centrally?
So it's not something we forecast. So because it's a local tax, then essentially that would be something that my understanding is that would be a council tax that would then be local government.
I mean, the answer would depend on how the government chooses to operate it and whether they choose to alter the general revenue grant that goes to local government to account for that, and we haven't looked at that.
You're not making an assumption that it's going to give an uplift to the central budget?
No, and again, part of it is because, as Claire said, is that the general revenue grant is the biggest component. So the question is, what's the net effect? So again, it's a bit like, you know, some of the conversation we had in council tax in general. You can increase council tax significantly, but if the general revenue grant goes down, the budget for council tax hasn't really changed. The councils hasn't really changed.
Okay. On the 22nd of December, you accepted a last-minute policy proposal. What was that in relation to?
So, I mean, again, so we set out the specifics of our timeline. So there was two changes to the timeline. One was an ask to extend it slightly, and one was to give a slight extension to a policy coming in. I don't think I know I can't recall exactly what the policy was. Typically, we wouldn't say what the policy was. In part because these are private conversations with the government, and it's, you know, they might ask for whatever reason to have a slight extension when it would only be if it was a significant material one that we'd say, well, we've not included it, that we would then publicly say that we've done it. But this is part of the day-to-day conversation we would have with the government to work through the specifics. We tend not to.
The material?
No, it was a small change.
Thank you. And then on there's a broader question I have, I suppose. Well, actually, I'll go with Scotland.
Yeah.
So there's some comment on the use of Scotland money. It's on the front page of the Scotsman today. I believe you spoke about it at Glasgow University yesterday. is your understanding that that money is going to be used into general revenue rather than for the purposes that it's been set out previously, which is supporting the transition to net zero?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. So paragraph 2.22, we set out ScotWind and, we set out the Crown Estate, of which ScotWind is the biggest part of it. And we talked there of over the period 25-26 to 29-30, 344 million of revenues will be used for capital spending and 308 million will be used for resource spending. So there's a couple of things I would say. So one is that the government are clearly using all the flexibilities they've got at their disposal to try and boost expenditure, both in revenue and capital over the period of time. And it's entirely appropriate that they use the ScotWind revenues, because if not, they're just sitting there in a bank account, not doing anything and any value. The government have been quite clear about wanting to try and use that as a mechanism to invest in net zero and to use it as capital investment. And we know that that's what they were doing last year. We note that the fact that they are planning to use some of the budget for projections for budget in 27-28, which is particularly challenging for the budget. So the government's revenue budget is particularly weak growth in 27-28. Once you adjust for Social Security, it's actually going down in real terms. So the government are planning, our understanding is that the government have essentially allocated presumption that they will use some ScotWind revenues to prop up resource spending in 27-28 of about 236 million. And I guess 2 points we would make around that. One is it's not great to be using one-off resources to pay for day-to-day expenditure, because by definition, once you've used that, then you cannot use it again. Secondly, though, again, as the government are trying to manage their budget, what they've done in the past is earmark ScotWind resources to be used, but then actually not followed through on it, because the block grant will go up or something will happen in taxation. So they're using it as a fiscal management element to it, which again is entirely appropriate for them to do that. But we do caution that if you then follow through on your plan and have to use it for day-to-day expenditure, well, you've spent it and you can't use it again.
But it's to be, from a policy perspective, the stated intention for this money was that it was to be used for net zero transition, particularly around the North East, investment in skills and infrastructure to make sure we've got that economy function in the future. But you're saying that this is really just to prop up the revenue budget on a one-off basis, rather than a recurring investment in the future.
Yes, there's two parts to it. One is, what do you want to use the ScotWind resource for, which the government has said about their long-term plan around net zero. But again, given the constraints that they have and the fiscal tools available to them on things like the reserve, things like borrowing, the government have, over the last few years, used ScotWind essentially as a fund, as almost like an additional reserve that they can earmark to spend. But when it comes to the crunch, if you've got more money in, then you don't actually use ScotWind.
And that, I think, given the analysis from the IFS, the Fraser Valander, that looks unlikely. I mean, they're both predicting the likelihood of an in-year emergency budget. So that's a fair possibility this year, given how tight the numbers are. The idea that they're not going to draw down on this, I know that's into 27-28 for some of the allocations for this, but it feels like this use of one-off spending. I mean, is that an overall concern that we should be having, that actually this budget isn't going to get to the end of the year?
So that's certainly not something we would say or have a specific comment or seen any evidence that would be a problem. I guess one of the things I think we shouldn't lose sight of is that the government essentially have to balance the budget, and what they've got are various tools that they can use to smooth that expenditure over time. So it's entirely appropriate that the government use borrowing when they need to manage the reconciliations. That's the nature of the fiscal framework. They're not borrowing, they're just shifting money between years. Similarly with the ScotWind, that is resource that is there to be used, and it makes sense to use it. There's then a question about how appropriate you're using that, etc. But it's entirely fine for the government to plan to use that. And similarly, the NDRI pool is that we know that fluctuates, and the government are entirely within their rights to potentially use that. We also know, and this might be the first time ever, but we also know that typically at UK spending reviews, money comes later. So again, the government, in looking ahead, might be thinking to say, well, actually, we've got some plans to try and smooth spend, but if more block grant comes down the line, then that's what we'll then use to meet our spending plans, and then we'll be able to free up some of the commitments we've made around how much we'll put into the reserve, how much we'll borrow, how much we'll use of Scotland.
It's legally appropriate, clearly, and the government can make these decisions as they want, but it'd be concerning to us as members of this committee that we're seeing those predictions from independent analysts saying that this budget is running so close to the rails, having to allocate one-off savings, one-off pots of money to try and get through the process, that this has to be a matter of concern. I'm surprised that you don't perhaps share that concern.
Yeah, I mean, so the government always do this. So just to be clear, the government always use the different flexibilities over time to potentially manage it. I think, again, the point that we make is, as well, is that the overall funding envelope is exceptionally tight over the next few years. 1.1% real terms growth is exceptionally tight. Once you factor in the conversations we've had around pay and all those sorts of things, then balancing the budget is going to be exceptionally difficult, which is then not unsurprising that the government are then using all the various flexibilities they have to try and boost the funding allocation as much as possible.
And it's also that analysis saying that these are heroic assumptions, as we've already heard about the productivity, as well as some of the issues around workforce. Can I discuss the £1.5 billion of projected savings? So we've had that previously in MTFS, FSDP, which I think at that point it was around about £1 billion. Has that figure increased, or is that my recollection?
There were different numbers at the time, so they'd broken it back into different things around efficiency savings, what would come through public sector workforce, and then also what was broader public value, etc. So our understanding is that the 1.5 billion is essentially the savings that the government intend to do across all the various activities over the next 3 years. So that includes things like workforce savings, efficiency savings and the like.
Two-thirds of that is made up by the 3% recurring savings on NHS health boards. But my understanding is that that money is retained by the health boards.
Yes.
So in what respect is that a saving to the overall budget that allows us to close the fiscal gap between projected expenditure and the amount of money coming in?
Yeah, Eleanor and Claire might want to come in this a bit. In general, but the key point is you're right. So our understanding is that the efficiency savings that are made within portfolios essentially just then, is retained in there. So what overall you're seeing in health over the next few years is an increase in actual funding allocation, over £1 billion in real terms over the course of the spending review. So that's the first bit. The second bit is within that overall increase, the government are asking NHS to come up with an evidence around £1 billion worth of efficiency savings within there, and that essentially means that spending will essentially still grow by £1 billion, but you've also saved £1 billion within all of that. I guess the key bit for us, and again this is the bit which will be quite interesting I think in terms of the spending review, but also the portfolio efficiency plans, is a couple of paragraphs in the spending review about how this is going to be monitored over time. And that's the really interesting question as well. Where have these £1 billion worth of savings come from? Have they been delivered? And what has that money then been used for? So where has money been redirected into other areas? And that's the bit which will then come through, I guess, in the proof of the delivery plans and the efficiencies.
But the relationship to the resource gap by 2930, can you tell us how a member of the public would see that? We've been hearing your repeated warnings about the size of this resource gap. This is the amount of money that's been set out. In essence, is that an issue, therefore, that you would describe it as a curtailment of resource demand? Is that in terms of trying to fix that gap?
Yeah. So what the government did in the MTFS was essentially say, this is what we think, based on our current trajectories of things like, and using our social security. So just to be clear, this gap is a Scottish Government figure rather than ours, but they used our numbers to push forward and say, based on trends, on social security, based on pay, but also based on what we can see within our portfolios, this is how spending is likely to increase if we don't change tack. This is funding. And then that comes up with the £2.6 billion worth of resource. That number will have changed, clearly, because of the budget and changes in forecasts and social security. But it's based on essentially what the government think spending would be if nothing else changed. So the efficiency savings are designed to essentially manage that overall that overall demand in terms of spending. And then also then there's the funding, additional funding that is going to flow in as well. So the gap isn't a gap in the sense it's not a deficit, it's not something you would see, it's an internal management process within the government.
Okay, that's useful. So we've touched on the big tax changes in terms of the fiscal drag side of this and those numbers. Obviously, actually, the Cabinet Secretary made more play in her statement around the smallest tax change in history, according to a member of her tax advisory group. And that is would seem to be able to bolster this claim that Scots will or have or should pay less tax than the rest of the UK. And the SFC have been caught up in a bit of this in terms of the use of some of what the SFC have said. Are you comfortable that ministers have always made accurate and truthful statements regarding to the SFC's position in this matter?
Yeah, so we don't, ultimately it's up to the government to defend and talk about what they do around that. What we do is a couple of things, and we tried to expand that in our report by looking into things like median earners and the like. So what we do is we essentially say, based on our forecasts, what is the median income tax within Scotland over the next year, the next few years? And then our understanding is that then government use that, or then using that to help inform the tax decisions that they take. And then that then means that based on our projected forecast for median income taxpayers for next year, then they then gives them a chance to say whether or not the median income taxpayer is paying more or less within Scotland. Of course, that changes over time. So this is a forecast. So outturn data of what actual median income taxpayers would be will be different from what our forecast is. The reality of what a median income taxpayer isn't actually easy to put a particular number on, because it depends on net and pension contributions and the like. And I guess the point that we were then extending and trying to explain and articulate to people is that when we talk about the median income taxpayer, that includes things like pensioners and the like. So we've now expanded to look at, well, what's the median income, what's the median earner in Scotland and what's their relative position, and that's where you get a different story. So you get lots of different numbers to give you different stories, and we just produce the numbers.
We know for 23-24 that the claim is definitely false, because we have the outturn data, don't we?
If you get that, yeah, so the outturn data will differ from the forecast, but that's quite different, I think, from what saying that if the government are using, based on our forecast, what the median income taxpayer will be for that year, then that's entirely right to do that. You're right. Outturn data mean that statement is different. That's going to change, and that will go up and down because our forecast is always a forecast rather than outturn.
Yeah. So for clarity, I mean, so at Christmas I was telling family members and friends that Dundee United would definitely win the New Year derby. I was basing that on the data in front of me, the perspective. Yeah. That was my prediction about what would happen.
Yeah.
We lost 1-0, and rightly so. But the reality is, if I continued to claim that we had won, I would be a liar, wouldn't I?
I think the key point is, again, coming back, I'm not going to predict Dundee United. It's difficult enough to predict a forecast, the economy. But I guess the point is that for us, and this is why we don't get involved in this debate, what we do is forecast income tax median earners for the next year. The government, if they then set their policy and then said, based on that forecast, median incomes in Scotland, the median income person in Scotland will pay less tax. That's where essentially we end, because we then don't. It's not our job to go back and evaluate the kind of outturn and do that. And the outturn will differ from the forecast. Yeah. That's just the nature of making forecasts and the outturn.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Patrick, to followed by Michelle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I was actually going to start on some of the issues that Michael had just finished on there, so it leads on quite well. You gave a bit of a warning earlier when we were talking about making comparisons of tax policy with other countries. You gave the example of Scandinavian countries, and you made the point that a comparison isn't easy to make, isn't necessarily easy to understand, because it doesn't compare all aspects of the proposition that's put between government and citizens around not only tax but also public services, investment and so on. Isn't it reasonable that the same warning should be given in relation to comparisons with the rest of the UK now? That the there is an increasing gap not only in tax policy but in what people get in return for that, and we should be placing less reliance on those comparisons.
So a couple of things I would say in that. So one is we obviously have the same tax system relative to the rest of the UK, so that comparison is much easier to do than it would be to somewhere like Scandinavia and the like. And also we operate in a devolved framework within that context. So what we do on income tax, because the definitions of income are the same, because personal allowance is the same, then it's actually relatively straightforward as to say the question for an income taxpayer in Scotland and the UK, what's the relative difference in income that is taxed there? Just in exactly the same way as we do the equivalent, which is on Social Security, where we say, if you look at Social Security, then the Scottish Government are spending an additional £1.1 billion next year on Social Security relative to what would be equivalent if they delivered the same payments in the rest of the UK. So I think your point is entirely right, but equally we do it on both sides. So we don't just do it on tax, we do it on spending as well.
But isn't it fair to say that there's probably a little bit too much reliance on the part of the Scottish Government more than anybody else on this political rhetoric about a claim about precisely what proportion of people pay less tax than they would do elsewhere in the UK, because it detracts from the fact that their kids aren't going to be 50 grand in debt for getting a degree, or that their community has fewer children growing up in poverty as a result of those changes. Aside from the political rhetoric, the value that the government feels it has in the political rhetoric of saying most people pay less tax, does it actually matter in terms of the responsible management of public finances? Does the precise proportion of people paying less tax matter beyond political rhetoric?
So on the first point, I think from certainly our engagement with stakeholders would be is that it does matter if you're looking at business and industry, for example, that there is a conversation that takes place, and Justine might want to say a bit more from experience in the ICAS days, is that there's a conversation about what is the relative tax burden on income tax relative to the rest of the UK, and that is a conversation that takes place. So I think, again, that comparison between Scotland and the rest of the UK as an impact, just in the same way as people will say, well, if we live in Scotland, we're not paying for university tuition and we're receiving these other benefits as well. I think it's then up to the government about how they then use their political narrative about taxation, just in the same way as it would be the same for the opposition parties to use a similar narrative about whether Scotland's the highest tax part of the UK or whether the median taxpayer is paying slightly less. I mean, the point that I would say about on the median taxpayer debate, it seems an exceptionally, and I get the politics of it, but it seems an exceptionally amount of effort has gone into a relative difference of about £40 or, etc., which just seems, given everything else that's going on, it seems like a lot of wasted energy or a lot of energy going into debate about specifics.
Trying to make is that when Scotland moved from the 3-band to the 5-band tax system, and some of that was ideas that were developed in the 2016 Green Manifesto. Actually, what was implemented was pretty close to that. Mm-hmm. There was a reasonable case to give some reassurance to people that the tipping point was going to be roughly in the middle, roughly average. But the longer this has gone on, the more spurious it becomes to try and pin it down to precise figures and maintain that as an absolute, it must be a more than 50% or less than 50%, because that becomes an increasingly vague area of in the middle.
Yeah, and I agree entirely. For a small amount of saving, and I was saying, it comes back to the conversation I had with Michael there as well, is that then will change over time, because we do it on a forecast. So clearly government have to set that decision on a forecast because they don't know what it's going to be. Outturn would potentially change. The broader issues, which I think, which again get squeezed out by this conversation, is that we look at the median income taxpayer in Scotland, but then that's quite different from the median full-time earner in Scotland. That's quite different from the number of people who are then in bands that are changing over the time. And the conversation is does that structure look right? Is that what we want? We've got a more progressive system that therefore changes over time. So I think those are the broader policy questions rather than for me, the kind of political rhetoric of
Can
it.
I ask about the gap between what you call the policy-only position in terms of what the Scottish tax policy will generate compared with the reality? You call it a tax-based performance gap, but there are probably various different elements of why it's happening, some of which is about economic activity, some of which is about behavioural change, some of it which might be about how policy is being applied by both governments. Are there specific measures that the Scottish Government could take to reduce that beyond the aspiration to have a more successful economy in however you define that? Are there mechanistic changes that could reduce that gap?
Yeah, so what the tax-based performance gap, just to be clear, what it does is it essentially is a modelled estimate that we do and say if Scotland had performed, tax-based had performed the same as the UK overall, how much money would the Scottish Government be raising from their more progressive tax policies? And that comes up with a number for next year of just over 1.7 billion. Mm-hmm. And then what we then say is, okay, well, how much are they actually raising and what's the difference between the two? So it's a very broad kind of then, well, what's the difference? What's the reasons for all of that? And that's where we highlight its behavioural change will be in there. Relative economic performance will be in there as well between Scotland and the UK. Some of that relative economic performance will be performance that the Scottish Government can control. Mm-hmm. Some of it will be UK Government decisions having impact in Scotland that is explaining the differential. Some of that will be things completely out of control of any government, such as energy changes, different effects of tariffs or uncertainty having an impact coming through. And then the final bit would be is what we call kind of tax-rich growth. So the fact is that the UK has got the City of London, for example. So for the same earnings and the same employment, then they're going to collect much more tax revenues than we would do in there. So that's what goes into that. And I think the general comment then would be by the government is how do you then do your best to understand all the different components that go into that, and what can you then do to try and if you want to, try and narrow that gap.
So within that, what are the elements that are most amenable to some kind of action to control it?
So the big drivers that we talk about are particularly on earnings and particularly on higher earnings. So if you have a progressive income tax system, then the more you can do to grow high earning employment, the relative impact that has on your tax take. And that's not a political comment. It's just simply being if you're taxing people at 42 pence on their marginal earnings as they move up the income distribution, you're going to collect a lot more revenue from that than you would do if you're creating jobs and employment at the kind of basic rates of tax. So the key for the government, I think, or the key for the tax system, if you only have one tax, income tax, and it's progressive, and you've made it more progressive, is to do your best to try and create high-value jobs, because that has a disproportionate impact upon the revenue you'll collect. And we've had some rules of thumb in the past which we can share, which is like for every 1 percentage point relative improvement in Scotland relative to the UK, I think you raise about £35 million. For every kind of general increase in earnings, because of our more progressive system in Scotland, you'll raise more revenue than you do in England because you've got these higher tax bands.
Finally, I just wanted to ask about some of the issues around local government that came up, and recognising that you say you don't make forecasts around council tax and so on, you don't take responsibility for those issues because they're a local tax. But there are aspects of the impact on local government finance which derive not from local decisions but from Scottish or UK decisions. In particular, some councils at the moment are experiencing significant pressure on homelessness as a result of changes to, a combination of changes to asylum policy at UK level and the nature of homelessness legislation that's been passed on a cross-party basis in the Scottish Parliament. When there are devolved policy choices that have fiscal consequences, the framework says that those fiscal consequences sit with the devolved government. When there are reserved policy choices that impact, there is no mechanism that recognises that those fiscal consequences should sit at the UK level. Is there any effort to try and create a mechanism that would do something comparable to protect the local services that are under pressure because of UK decisions, in the same way that the fiscal framework currently says that the Scottish Government should carry the fiscal cost of making devolved policy changes.
So if I can understand specifically on that, so there are some, and Claire might want to come in, and Eleanor, and specifics as well. So in some areas, reserved areas which have an impact there, so like the migrant surcharge, for example, then that essentially flows into the Scottish budget. And even though it's a UK-wide decision on migration policy, the surcharge is raised at the UK level. The Scottish Government gets funding for that as a result of that flowing through. So that's one where there's a direct mechanism from UK reserve changes flowing through to the Scottish budget, and it's up to the Scottish Government to decide what they then do with that. And I don't know if you've got the number to hand about what that is. There is then within the fiscal framework there is the opportunity for the government to raise concern about where there is a reserved impact, a reserved policy that having a fiscal cost within devolved areas, and there's there's various mechanisms that have been used in the past around that, things like Olympics, funding for the Olympics, etc., and how they pass through. So the government could potentially raise that as an issue. The more broader issue is that I think on the specifics around local government, within that, all we can see at the moment is the overall allocation for local government. So on things like homelessness and things like asylum seekers coming in, that's ultimately all going to be managed within the overall budget that local government have to have. There'll be various spending lines that the government will set out for in there, but that's not the level of detail that we would go into. Yeah, so for 26-27, the migrant surcharge is £198 million. So that will be money flowing into the Scottish budget from the migrant surcharge.
Okay, thank you.
Michelle?
Thank you very much for this session. I've enjoyed it a great deal, but listening to it strikes me all over again that we've spent as much time through the entirety of the session talking about the fiscal framework in operation and the implications therein as we have actually focused on the budget. So rather than coming to yourself, Professor Roy, I want to invite Dr Ryan and Justine to give us some reflections on your first sojourn into this process, what you think and why you think it. And I'm not asking from any political point of view, I'm asking a question about process, and you may also within that want to reflect further on risk, but it's entirely up to you.
So I think that's a very fair reflection. I think it's not my first outing with the fiscal framework, as you know. I have some history with it, and the earlier iteration of it, I was involved in implementing it when I was within government. My reflection is if one were able to start with a completely blank sheet of paper, you probably wouldn't design it like this. But of course, you don't get to start with a completely blank sheet of paper. You have to introduce something that two governments will sign up to, that the Parliament is prepared to accept, that accepts all the different complications and wrinkles that already exist, and I include in that the Barnett formula. And so a lot of the complexity of it and the way that it operates reflects a political reality at the time that it was being negotiated and has been renegotiated. It's right, I think, that we're spending an enormous amount of time on this because it does have a huge impact. Everything about funding really goes back to performance relative to UK government decisions relative to Scottish government decisions. It creates an environment where you're constantly looking at the comparison between the two. Whether that's desirable for the future, I won't offer a view, but I think you're right to say that it is a big factor in everything we're looking at.
I mean, again, I know
Graham Roy said earlier that David Heald in our next session will get onto it, but I think perhaps a killer sentence from his submission said, and I quote, "The fiscal flexibility of the Scottish Government does not match its exposure to fiscal risk." And that seems to me to be quite fundamental here and now, but even more so when you look forward potentially to the introduction of Scottish bonds, for example. Yes, they're a different funding stream, but they potentially, if they go ahead, produce even further complexity and therefore risk. What's your thinking, and we will ask David when he's in front of us, but what's your thinking about that sentence in terms of exposure to fiscal risk?
So I think it's right that we've spent quite a bit of time talking about things like Crown Estate revenues, and we've talked about borrowing, and we've talked about the reserve, and these tools that the Scottish Government have to try to manage the risks on the budget and try and match the spend to the funding that's coming through. And when we're talking about using things like Crown Estate revenues and borrowing and so on, the borrowing power and the Scotland Reserve are built into the fiscal framework. They are not huge compared to the scale of the risks that the government is managing, which I think is Graham's point, which is why you wind up using all the other flexibilities that you can around non-domestic rates, around Crown Estate revenues. So I think there's definitely something about making sure that the tools that are available to the government are sufficient to allow it to manage the things that all governments, devolved and not dissolved, have to do. As far as the issue about bonds, you have to make a judgment. You have if you've decided you want to borrow as the government, you have the National Loans Fund as an option. You have bonds as an option. You have to evaluate what you're trying to do, what the risk profiles are. I don't think it's inherently better or worse to issue bonds. I think it's a judgment you have to make based on what you're trying to achieve.
You're developing a capital market for a start, and that's a fundamental. And I'm sure we'll come on to that more in the future, but I wanted to get your reflections as well about, I mean, obviously your background, your experience from ICAS, would any of your members have chosen to run their business like this? What's your reflections as the first time through the process?
Thank you. I think to give you a very sort of brief summary, I think it's it's a jigsaw with a lot of moving parts that's possibly sitting on a travelator. I've been an observer of the fiscal framework and everything else that goes with it since the legislation was brought in and the powers came in. And obviously I've been watching from the sidelines, and I've also, I've done quite a lot of university lecturing and things like that on, all the different moving parts and how would you do it to the students if you were a country that was doing this for the first time? Would you do it like this, or would you do it differently? So we've had a lot of these discussions, but I think, to me, the key to getting to the bottom of all the moving parts on the travelator is better data and, more transparent. The more transparent the reporting can be and the better the data can be, the better handle we can get on it, and the better handle you can get on it and the Scottish Government can get on it, and everybody can see it. It's much more visible. And I think visibility is key to that, because part of the thing with the risk element is the fact that the visibility isn't there sometimes, and therefore you can't assess the risk as accurately as you might like to. And in terms of ICAS members, I wouldn't like to speak on their behalf. The air might be blue, I don't know. But, certainly, if you think of it as a business, then, the risks, you definitely need to be flagging those to yourself on a very, very regular basis with such a tight budget.
And I should probably and appropriately give the last word to yourself, Professor Roy. But just adding in one more consideration, that of short-termism, the fact that there's two major political events that are meshed up in this process, i.e. the Scottish election and the UK general election, plus, as we know, the moving parts of late fiscal events that you've already alluded to, and the ongoing kind of new monies that turn out to be not new monies via fiscal transfers. So just give me your final reflections on what I'm saying and the point about transparency. If we have more transparency that merely enables us to obsess yet further about the operation of the fiscal framework, that may be giving the illusion of a step forward, but it's not really at all. So just your final comments and all of that, where we are, because things have to be better from an efficiency and effectiveness point of view, surely.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair point. I mean, I think so. Ultimately, our role is to talk about the fiscal framework. So, and that's why we can comment about some things in the budget. But ultimately, that's not our area. So, I guess part of the thing is so that we don't suck out the oxygen to have a broader conversation about where the budget is heading as well. And I think that when you have the Cabinet Secretary next week, will be a really important opportunity to explore some of the details that we can touch on in general about where spending is heading. But the specifics in that, I think in the broader fiscal framework, and we've spoken about this regularly, is that it is exceptionally complex. And I think the review that will come out, or the next time of the review, again, is a chance for us to have a look at whether there are variations that you can be done within that to make it more transparent, or to at least give greater flexibility. And we've spoken things like the reserve, for example. You know, if the reserve was bigger as a result of potential reforms, that would mean that you could then have more flexibility about how you manage it, and then you wouldn't be then having to have so much moving parts within the other areas like Scotland or Crown Estate and the like. And the final part I would make, though, about a lot of this transparency is that there are steps that government can do to make it more transparent. So spending being the obvious one. The steps have been made around the fact that we're now putting routine transfers in, but I think the very first question that the convener had for me at the start was, well, why are there still routine transfers that are not in the comparisons? That's not the fiscal framework. That's the government could do that if they wanted to.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And because we're well over time, a tiny supplementary from Michael.
Yeah, very briefly, having seen the published Scottish Spending Review, I think we're all still in the dark as to the methodology that was pursued. Do you know what methodology was pursued by the government, and can you tell us?
No. So, I mean, I think we obviously had the conversation with the government. They walked us through, the various decisions and how they did it, in terms of how they come up with overall numbers. But there's none of that, not detail about how we go down it. And I think one of the things that we highlighted what we wanted to see when we said the spending review was coming out. So one was doing it was a step forward, but second was the level detail beyond levels 1 and 2, so down into details level 3 split by revenue and capital. And then the point I made repeatedly about, for me, it's the process and what's the process you've gone through. How did you come up with these numbers? How do your efficiency savings link into all of that? How are you going to monitor them? How are you going to evaluate it? How are you going to track it? That's not published anywhere really in any detail. I think there's 2 paragraphs in the spending review, and I think that is would be really interesting to get more detail on that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's only going to be one more question for me, but I should say I always find it a bit bizarre that everyone talks about whether it's 50 or 55% or whatever the figure is in terms of people better off in income tax. But we do all know that Band D council tax in Scotland is about £770 less than it is in England. So that's a significant tax saving for most people who pay that tax. Anyway, the question I was going to ask you is, in terms of the accuracy of your forecasts over the last 5 years or so, have they proven to be more or less accurate than those of the OBR?
So we publish our forecast evaluation report. So our job is to evaluate our own forecast. We don't mark anybody else's homework. Yeah.
Exactly the same, as you're probably well aware.
Yeah, so we set out where our forecasts change, and I guess clearly there's a lot of moving parts at the moment. There's a lot of government policy changes, there's a lot of economic changes that mean that things are moving around. So we try and focus on what we can do to make our forecast better.
You have said in the past that that they have overestimated, for example, productivity growth. So clearly, you do feel that the SFC's forecasts have proven to be more accurate.
So I wouldn't say that specifically. I mean, we've revised down our forecasts and productivity as well. What we do is highlight where there are differences in our forecasts relative to the OBR and talk you through the risks there. So earnings being a classic example this time, where we highlighted this time last year that there was a risk in how our forecasts were higher than the OBR. That was a risk to the budget. The OBR revised up. That's closer. But I'm sure I'll be sitting here in a year's time explaining why our forecasts have been revised and the OBRs haven't.
When you're a politician, you can't get a straight answer, isn't it? Okay, well, thank you very much for your evidence session this morning. Is there anything you want to conclude? Anything you feel we should have touched on that we haven't mentioned, or something? Any specific points any of you, your team, wish to raise? Now's your chance. No? Okay. Well, thank you very much. We greatly appreciate your evidence. As always, I'm just going to call a 5-minute break to have a change of witnesses. Thank you. For our next evidence session on the Scottish Budget 2026-27, I welcome to the meeting Professor Mary Spowage, Professor of Practice and Director, Fraser Vallender Institute, University of Strathclyde, Professor David Heald, Emeritus Professor, Adam Smith Business School, University of Glasgow, and Professor David Bell, Professor of Economics, University of Stirling. Good morning to you all, and apologies for keeping you waiting as the last session overran. I'd also like to thank you for your helpful written submissions, and we'll move straight to questions. I think the first one will be to yourself, Professor Heald, if others can comment. What you've said is, and I quote, "The Westminster Parliament does not take the ex-ante scrutiny of public expenditure seriously, unlike the devolved legislatures. The disruption caused to budget procedures of the devolved legislatures clearly does not rank highly in the timing decisions of UK government." So I'm just wondering if you can expand on the impact that actually has.
If you want to see the truth of what I wrote there, you should watch the estimates day debates in the House of Commons. The House of Commons is very good through the Public Accounts Committee at the ex post scrutiny of public spending, but not of the budget before. And partly it's a question of power relationships between the two parliaments, but I do not think the UK government takes seriously enough the fact that the constitutional structure of the United Kingdom has changed and the devolved legislatures need time to set their own budgets. And a lot of effort went in at the beginning of the establishment of this parliament and then through the budget review group to actually try to improve the budget process. But when the UK doesn't run the budget until the end of November, and one of the issues that came up in the previous session were the increased interconnections between what happens at the UK level and what the Scottish funding position is. The UK ought to take it more seriously if it wants the devolved settlement to work.
Yeah, and I mean, you've got, wanting to say the limited attention to detailed choices in the Scottish Budget 26-27 is motivated by the urgency of securing parliamentary approval in order to limit disruption to public service delivery. So would it be right in saying that what you're saying there is that because the budget, the UK budget was so late, it meant that the Scottish process has been truncated and therefore, you know, the priority is really just to get a budget through?
Yes. I mean, I think the priority, I mean, clearly I would want the Parliament to be, committee and the Parliament to be debating what's in the Scottish budget. But I think one of the things which the Scottish Government deserves credit for is actually getting a three-year spending review. There may be problems, as was said in the last session, about the kind of information that's in that. But one of the things that's destabilised spending is the fact that there has not been UK multi-year spending reviews until the last UK one quite recently. So that it's given the increasing complexity of the relationships between the two spending systems, I think and particularly, obviously, one of the difficulties the Scottish Government has is this was a spending review coming at the end of a parliament. Now, the whole idea really of spending reviews is to have them at the beginning of the parliament, and presumably, whatever the political composition of the next Scottish Government, they're going to want to have a relook at certain things. But I would very much urge that one of the things that would benefit efficiency improvements in the public sector in Scotland is actually having stability of funding. Not knowing your funding, one of the things which I think is extremely damaging is when you actually have in-year search for savings. Because sooner or later, people are going to learn how to spend the money earlier in the financial year for fear that their money gets taken off them later on in the financial year.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Labour did way back when, in 1997, was to stick with Conservative, budgetary decisions for 2 years, which did, whether you agreed with those decisions or not, it did actually allow for some stability. So what you're suggesting is that at least by getting this budget through, one hopes that a new government will stick to those, at least in the first year, and then they can perhaps develop their own proposals. Would you suggest?
I mean, I would recommend that.
Okay, thank you. Now, Professor Bell, one of the difficulties, I think, for the Scottish Government is that it's really at the mercy of whenever the UK government decides to hold a budget, and they just have to get on with it. And what we saw was something, you know, from 30th of October in 2024 to 26th November in 2025 to immediately take, you know, 4 weeks out of the process, and yet the budget has to be passed before the new financial year. So local authorities, health boards, everybody else knows their budget, council tax have to be set, etc. So what, if anything, can the Scottish Government do about that difficult situation whereby it just has to effectively take what's given to it in regard to budget decisions, timing decisions?
I mean, I agree with everything David has said, and personally I would apologise for the brevity of my commitment, but I was committed to
today.
Okay, well, but I was committed to other stuff, and the whole process has just been so truncated that it was difficult to find time to write something longer. I mean, the fiscal framework, I think, was the latest version was established with an understanding that, you know, there would be goodwill between the parties, and it does seem to me that with the date selection by the UK government, the Scottish budget has been so truncated that it is difficult to put all these budgets in places for the health boards, for the local government, and so on. And I think, you know, in terms of the fiscal framework review, the timetabling has to be raised as a significant issue going forward.
One of the things I think, not just that the Scottish but other devolved parliaments have basically been saying, is that there's no real consultation on that. Is that right, Professor Spouge?
That's my understanding, and obviously if the UK government had asked the devolved governments whether the end of November was ideal from their parliamentary timetable point of view, they would have said no, the earlier the better. From my perspective, there was no need to wait until the end of November for this budget, and it could have been done much earlier, which would have solved some of these issues. I would hope for an earlier budget this year, not just because of the impact on devolved governments, but also because of the kind of general economic commentary and uncertainty that was caused by the way that the budget was carried out, you know, with the endless leaking of potential policies that were then, you know, backtracked on and so on. It wasn't good for the economic and business investment environment, as well as it being subpar for the devolved governments and the parliamentary processes that we have to go through up here.
Yeah, I mean, the Chancellor said that she will only have one fiscal event, which I think is positive. Do you think that the Chancellor should, you know, basically say, she may wish to keep some flexibility, of course, but that it should be the last week in October or whatever, and have a kind of set date almost for it, so that everyone can plan?
I think I would welcome that, more predictability. There will always be times when they will reserve the right to change that decision, of course. But I think if that was broadly the expectation, I think that would be much better, and then we would know that the Scottish budget could always be before Christmas, which would at least give us a bit more time for parliamentary scrutiny in sessions like this after the budget's published.
I mean, one of the difficulties in this committee is that, you know, in 27 years of devolution, we've never had a Chancellor of the Exchequer ever give evidence to this committee or its predecessor, despite numerous invitations, and now it's been extremely difficult. We certainly haven't managed it in this term to get a Chief Secretary of the Treasury in front of the committee either, although we have in previous terms with previous governments. So I think that's a real difficulty, that we ourselves cannot talk directly, despite the fact that the UK government provides somewhere in the region of 60% through the block grant of our overall expenditure in this Parliament.
No, yeah, absolutely. I think we would all welcome more respect shown for this committee and the legislature from politicians in the Treasury to come and speak to you. I know there's good engagement with organisations like the OBR, for example. They've always been very willing to come and speak to the committee and answer the questions, given, you know, the irony of devolution has been of these significant powers is that the budgets and what's happening at the UK level, you know, it seems even more interconnected than before these powers were devolved, given the fiscal framework and the block grant adjustments. So, you know, I've really welcomed that engagement from the OBR, but it would be good to see much more engagement from the Treasury and Treasury ministers.
Now, some of the questions I was going to ask Professor Heald with regard to your own paper were asked of the SFC in the previous session, so I'm not going to intrude on my colleagues' toes because they may wish to ask the same or similar questions as well. But you have basically expressed a frustration, I think, in the pages of this paper with regard to the understanding that people have of the tax system in Scotland relative to the UK. Because basically what you've said is, so I'll just quote what it says here, in terms of a supporting document to the Scottish Government, it basically says 54% of respondents felt they understood the UK tax system and the UK tax is paid, compared to 41% who understood it in Scotland. In regard to the devolved taxes they pay, this is broadly in line with the last 3 years. But you go on to say, if this was true, why do the UK and Scottish governments engage in so much subterfuge? And are you referring there to fiscal drag specifically, or is that part of a number of issues where you have concerns that Scottish and UK governments pull the wool over the people's eyes?
I mean, fiscal drag is the most obvious one.
Yeah.
One of the things the Scottish Government wants is the Scottish tax system to be more progressive than the rest of the UK. Broadly, I support that political objective, but it can be done in sensible ways and it can be done in destructive ways. Fiscal drag, if you think that the tax structure year one is right, actually freezing personal allowances and freezing tax thresholds just basically distorts it. And over time, as was mentioned in the previous session, more and more people are getting into the higher rate in Scotland. Now, if you're going to have 6 tax bands, it's ludicrous that 3 tax bands are trivially different, and then you get a jump from 22 to 42. And it was also raised in the last session, it's going to start affecting penny negotiations. There's a famous story when Newcastle United Football Club wanted to hire Ruud Gullit as their manager. He asked for 2 million as his salary, which was a lot of money for managers in those days. But then he said, no, I mean 2 million net. And increasingly, people with having a lot of public sector professionals like surgeons in the higher rates, you're going to start getting people, trade unions and individuals, starting to negotiate for net pay. So I think that you need much more honesty about the fact that the Scottish Government goes on about 55% of Scottish taxpayers pay less tax than they would in England, but the proportion of Scottish adults who don't pay income tax is about 33%. And I calculated that about 30% of Scottish adults are actually paying more tax than if they were in England. Now, basically, given the demographic pictures and the international uncertainty, trade tariffs and so on, the failure to recover from COVID and from the global financial crisis, if the Scottish public want the same bundle of public services that they now get, everybody's going to have to pay more tax. That's the political choice. You could either have more tax and keep the spend, less tax and cut the spend, or some mixture. But that's a political reality which this Parliament and the UK Parliament has to face.
I mean, I remember, just on your rude anecdote, I remember DeLorean famously asked the UK government in the 1980s for $1 billion to support his factory in Northern Ireland, and he meant $1 billion, and the UK government gave him £1 billion, so he's well chuffed. I think the issue about fiscal drag is really the fact that governments of whatever colour, because the Conservative government, the Labour government, the SNP government, have all implemented fiscal drag, as we know. It's trying to raise as much money as possible with the least political damage done to themselves, and I think that's really the reality of the situation that we're in terms of that. So they're all trying to actually do that. I mean, in terms of a progressive system, I mean, you Professor Heald, have spoken, and I'm going to ask the others this same kind of question. You've been very concerned about the UK tax system because it's not progressive like that. It kind of goes up and down and round about and all. It's like a skyline in New York, basically. You know, when you look at it. If you look at how it works. So I'm just wondering how, if you, became Scotland's president for life in a devolved context, and you were able to actually implement a progressive system in Scotland, not as an independent country, but the system we have now, how would we be able to make that more progressive without having to take into account the UK system we have to put it on? Now, it wouldn't be perfect, clearly, but how could we do that gathering much the same kind of revenue? Where would the kind of splits be in terms of, because you talked about 22% and 42%, so I'm just wondering how you would do that, really. I mean, we might have to take 5 years or whatever, but how would it be done?
I mean, if you're going to have 6 rates, they should go up more gradually. But the crucial problem at the moment that you referred to is the effect of the difference between the lower Scottish higher rate threshold and the UK higher rate threshold, and the fact that national insurance contributions, the drop from 8 to 2, goes at the UK threshold. And the other one is that Alistair Darling brought in as Chancellor, I think in 2009, the withdrawal of personal allowance from incomes over 100,000. Now it's still 100,000. Still 100,000. No. So we've got ludicrous peaks in it, which, if you want to provoke behavioural effects, that seems to be a pretty good way to do it.
So, but how would you?
You basically try to get a reasonably smooth progression of average tax rates.
Okay, so we don't control the personal allowance, obviously, in Scotland. That's not devolved. But where should the breaks be, if you like? So we all know, for example, that someone in Scotland who's earning 44,000 pays a higher marginal rate, for example, than someone paying 51,000. Because of the difference in the UK and in the national insurance implications. I'm just wondering where you would set those kind of different kind of breaks, if you like, or changes.
I mean, given the kind of complex fiscal relationships between the UK and Scotland, I would not have a different high rate thresholds to the UK. Particularly specifically because of the national insurance issue. I certainly wouldn't have the withdrawal. If you're going to withdraw personal allowance, I would do it at an income much higher than 100,000.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue about the Scottish Government now, I think the Scottish Government now does realise, in actual fact, at the area where, the 43,667 at which you start paying the higher rate is too high, but the difficulty in increasing that is a loss of tax revenue now, obviously, so that's the issue.
Yeah. I mean, in defence of the Scottish Government about fiscal drag, one of the considerations the Scottish Government must have had this time is, given the UK decisions, the block grant adjustments would have got bigger if Scotland hadn't done it.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the point I made about the increased interconnections.
Indeed. Professor Spouge.
Yeah, I mean, because the higher rate threshold has been frozen in Scotland for so many years, the freezing of that has fundamentally sort of changed the structure of who and how many taxpayers are paying higher rate or above. From around 12% of taxpayers in 16-17, and by the end of the forecast period in 2030-31, it's forecast to go up to about 30% of taxpayers are going to be above that. So that's a fundamental change in our understanding of who a higher rate taxpayer is and what proportion of the income distribution sort of should be paying that at those higher rates of tax. As David says, some of these quirks in the income tax plus national insurance schedule are UK ones. But the 43 to 50,000 one is a uniquely Scottish one. And given the complexity from a tax efficiency point of view and looking at the marginal rates and ensuring that we don't introduce people making sort of choices we'd rather they didn't make about, working less or going part-time or anything else, I think it probably would be optimal from a tax efficiency point of view for those thresholds to be aligned so that, if you can't make the NICS threshold come down in line with the Scottish higher rate, then the higher rates should be aligned. They could offset that by increasing the rate of, say, the intermediate rate of tax. I think aligning the thresholds would cost around £600 million. So it's a lot that would be lost in lost revenue. But it would then remove that quirk. What we can see at the UK level is that there's significant bunching of people under the 100,000 mark. And this is because of the withdrawal of the personal allowance, but also the issues about tax-free childcare at £100,000, which are huge for people, for working parents. So you have this massive bunching of people who are keeping their income under that level so they don't lose particular childcare benefits, I think. The £75,000 threshold that was introduced in the government last budget but one, that's exacerbated that problem in Scotland, because now the marginal rate, if you're over 100,000, is 69%. Now, I know there will not be a huge amount of people in the country crying tears over somebody who's earning £100,000. Fine, but the issue is that it's not a sort of fair income tax schedule. And it does have implications for decisions people are making. We want someone who's earning £99,000 to increase their salary to £105,000, because then more tax is gone. We don't want them taking measures to reduce their income so they don't get over that. That's not good for the economy. It's not good for tax receipts. So there are these issues with the income tax schedule. But the Scottish Government have it in their power to remove the issue at the higher rate.
Operation and also people putting money into pensions and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's,
so they could do that whilst making changes to rates to offset it, if they wanted it to be revenue neutral. The trouble is, obviously, it seems politically easier to keep a threshold frozen than to increase a rate, which people they may pay a higher political cost for that.
Professor Bell.
I think the Scottish Government could engineer the reduction, offset the very high marginal rates at just over £100,000 if they altered the rates that were charged there. In theory, it would be nice to have a much more gradual increase in schedules and a system that people could understand, because I really think that the numbers where the thresholds are must baffle people. But of course, your question was about the tax system, not just about income tax. So we've got to think, I guess, more broadly about taxes. And taxes like council tax are not actually very progressive at all. So income tax is the most progressive tax, but it's only part of the overall tax bill that we faced. And although the new mansion tax is a gesture towards progression, it seems to me not one that will raise a huge amount of money. I think that the argument, which has gone on for decades now, that council tax needs to be reformed, is one that has a lot of traction. If your concern is perhaps that overall the Scottish tax system is not sufficiently progressive.
I've talked about loss aversion at this committee in the past, and the problem, of course, as we all know about council tax, reform is that the losers will be less than pleased with the government that introduces that, of whatever colour, which is why it hasn't happened in England either, although it's been done kind of modestly in Wales in the past. Now, I wanted to switch tack, because I want colleagues to come in. I just want to ask a couple more questions, because obviously other people are coming in and I end up getting sucked into a big discussion and other people can't come in. So, sustainability of social care, that's not something we really spoke about much in the previous session, and you've touched on that, Professor Bell. So, tell me about your concern about that, given the tightness of the local government settlement.
So actually, the reason that my submission was so short is that I was writing about social care in the UK context as a whole. And there are four things that I focused on. And I think in some respects, the Scottish Government are ahead of the game in relation to that. One, for example, is the greater provision of carers, for carers rather. There are way more unpaid carers in Scotland than there are employees in health and social care put together. Supporting these people is extremely important, because when they are no longer able to support people, the effect on the person being cared for is negative, but also then falls on local government and on the health service. Another area which is particularly concerning, it seems to me, is that we know that the number of 85-plus-year-olds in Scotland will nearly double between now and 2040 or thereabouts. That is the group most likely to need not just intensive care, but probably intensive care in a care home. So we do know that there's a huge need for more facilities in relation to that. Yet in the UK as a whole, in 2024, Frank Knight, the property consultants, estimated that there were 87 additional places in care homes across the UK as a whole. So Scotland, will not have had all of these, but it's incredibly low, the number, and that's because there is no properly scaled funding system to meet the potential costs, which can be, we're talking around £1,500 per week for those who are self-funders, and self-funders are all those who have more than £35,000 worth of capital, which is most people who are homeowners. So the effect of this is that there's not much investment going on in the sector, and that is almost, well, what's happening in England is at the moment is that I think there are around 2 million people with unmet need. So in effect, they're not getting care. So the overall position is severe. It will become critical, and continuing pressure on local government spending, they are the front line in relation to this particular issue.
You're saying it's better in Scotland than England, but it's still really worrying, and you get concerns that it's going to get more concerning. I mean, Professor Spowage, one of the issues I think faces Scotland, we didn't talk about in the previous session, for example, was some of the deficits from health and social care partnerships. Is that something that Fraser Vanander have looked at, for example, and the implications of that?
We haven't looked specifically at the finances of health and social care partnerships, but also along with the sorts of efficiencies that are being expected from NHS boards as part of the spending review. It does cast quite a lot of doubt, I think, on the deliverability of some of these plans that the government have set out, and the extent to which it's reasonable to expect these sorts of cuts in overall spending envelopes, or less growth in the case of health than otherwise would have been the case, without it impacting on frontline public services. The real terms cuts to local government funding over the period of the spending review are particularly worrying when you look at what was assumed in the MTFS in June, and the extent to which these are lining up with each other. So there was an assumption that social care spending would be rising at the same sort of level as health spending, so 3.3% in real terms a year. Lo and behold, when we see the spending review, health spending isn't going up by that much. It's going up sort of 6% over the 3 years, so not 3.3%. You could say that's because of the efficiencies they're assuming. But to what extent other parts of local government budgets are being assumed to be eaten up by this increase in social care spending, or are the government now assuming that it will not grow to this extent? If you speak to people in the social care sector, there's so much concern right now about the deliverability of care packages, the changing in sort of eligibility requirements for adult social care. The sector is absolutely creaking and in crisis right now, and the lack of funding that's going to be going into social care, it would appear from the spending review, it is really worrying, and is very different to what the government thought they would need to spend as part of the MTFS.
Professor Heald, you know, the Scottish Government's got a target of £576 million of savings in 26-27 for the portfolio efficiency and reform plans. Do you consider that to be realistic?
I don't know a great deal about those plans, but very clearly in the present context, that's going to be very difficult to achieve.
Okay. Now, Professor Spowage, capital is a real issue. We've got the infrastructure investment pipeline, along with colleagues. I was quite astonished that there didn't seem to be any timelines and any budgets next to that. But the overall capital budget, as we discussed in the previous session, is going to reduce by 5% in real terms, and that's if we use the GDP deflator over the next 5 years, which is, in my view, the wrong measure for capital because, you know, as we all know, construction costs are well ahead of that, and it gives an unrealistic picture as to what can be delivered, i.e. less than we would like. So what's your view on where we're going in terms of capital expenditure and over the next 5 years and what can be delivered through it?
Well, just in the GDP deflator and which measure of inflation should be used here, you know, I can see it from both perspectives. There does need to be an official source of forecast inflation that is used, and you know that is not often done for individual sectors or individual items of spend. So there does need to be something agreed, official, always produced regularly, that can be used to deflate things so that they can be compared. Also, so we can compare resource and capital budgets. So I would prefer that the GDP deflator is used for the main series because of that, so that it is the official source that's used, but that there are sensitivities done to illustrate the point that you're making, Convener, which is that if, as has been the case in recent years, construction inflation is running much further ahead, doesn't always be the case, as you also pointed out in the previous session, you know, what is the impact on the spending power that the government will actually you know, have access to, so that we can see if construction inflation you know, pans out in different scenarios, it's going to mean that less spending is going to be available. And indeed, we would expect the government, I suppose, to say how they would respond to that. You know, if the spending power is actually 10% less than the central scenario here, how are you going to respond to that? How are you going to prioritise? As you said, the infrastructure investment pipeline, that's not what it's called now, is it? Whatever the name of the document
pipeline
is right. You know, the committee have obviously been calling for an update to that for a number of years, given the sort of change in the situation since then. And I think it is interesting that we've got these different categories of projects. You know, as you say, even the ones that we know are going ahead without much detail, and the status of the ones in development, things like the Ardrossan Harbour project, for example. So I think we would all welcome more information as part of the next iteration of this plan on what does this mean is going to be delivered over the next Parliament. And to be honest, for the spending review more broadly, it was not the Scottish Government's choosing the timing of the UK spending review. I completely understand that. But I think what I would welcome, perhaps after a new government comes in, is that there is a more detailed version of this spending review set out, so that we have more understanding of how this is going to go down to level 3 budgets and beyond. And maybe as part of that, there could be much more detail on the capital side on what does this mean for the projects will be delivered over the period of this next Parliament. This is obviously for the next Scottish Government to do, but I think we would all welcome more clarity on that, perhaps even before the budget process for the next year of 27-28.
Sorry, I should say they have changed the name to the Infrastructure Delivery Pipeline, as Joanna's just pointed out. Professor Bell.
Just to add to your misgivings about the GDP deflator, I think there are three things that we need to worry about in relation to construction cost. One is materials cost, with the uncertainty around the world at the moment and the possibility of tariffs. That's one big thing. Energy costs is obviously another. And thirdly, migration and the restrictions that are now on migrant visas. Migrants are quite important in the construction sector, but they're also very important in the social care sector in supporting the British-born or Scottish-born workforce.
Yeah, my understanding is that since the 22nd of July, people now cannot come in on social care visas.
That's right.
I was just going to say that, and so whilst there's a tail of previously approved focused dependents and stuff coming in, you know, you can see the collapse in those numbers. So I think it's a real issue for the skill system in Scotland as well. We need to ask ourselves, for construction and for social care, how do we produce a pipeline of workers into these sectors? And that obviously links to the discussion about colleges and college funding, given the nature of where people are going to get these skills in Scotland.
I mean, I've got Aaron in my constituency, Montrose House, 15 staff, they're short 30%, so they've had to actually close 5 beds, and that's causing real concern in the island. Professor Heald, anything you wish to comment on with regard to capital?
No.
Okay, that's fine. I shall now open up the session to colleagues around the table. John, to be followed by Michael.
Thanks very much, Convener. Starting probably where I started last time as well, with inflation, I mean, the OBR was saying to us last week that inflation had stayed a bit higher than they had been anticipating, but they're still hopeful it will come down again. So, kind of your thoughts, Professor Bell, maybe, are you optimistic that inflation will come back down again?
I am not that optimistic that it will come down. I think the SFC and OBR are kind of obliged to assume that the Bank of England will get it right, and therefore their forecasts end up around 2%. But for some of the reasons that in relation to costs that I just spoke about, I think there will be continuing pressure on upward pressure on prices, both from the goods side and also continuing pressure from wages.
Yes.
I just don't see wages coming down to 2% plus whatever productivity growth we might have, which is likely, well, given recent trends, is likely to be relatively low.
Mm-hmm. And you've already said that, you know, if immigration is restricted, presumably that pushes
yes,
up the price of wages.
Sure.
What about tariffs then? I mean, is there a risk in there? I mean, does that just mean prices go up if we put a tariff on, say, American goods?
Yes is the answer to that. I think that will have less of an effect than the general upward pressure on wages. It seems to me, because we do, not that. I might be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there isn't all that much American goods input to the kinds of product that most people buy, and they're not going to put tariffs on their high tech exports or their service exports, which come through a software. A lot of it.
Yes, Professor Heald.
Nothing to add
on that bit, right, Professor Spout?
Yeah, just to agree that from an imports point of view, the UK doesn't import a huge amount from the US that couldn't be substituted for fairly easily. And the goods side, this trade with the US is much more about our exports, i.e. whisky, and our services relationships, which obviously could be impacted by the current situation, but that will be less easy to sort of see and sort of model than something like tariffs on goods. As often in these trade conversations, everyone focuses only on goods, whereas the majority of our exports now are services. So yeah.
Okay. Now, in your paper, seeing with you, you talk about the significant underlying deficit of £659 million. Now, can you just explain what that means? Because we've got to balance our budget every year, so in a sense, we can't have a deficit.
Yes, but we were sort of commenting on these repeated statements by the government that they have to balance a budget every year, unlike the UK government. And we were sort of pointing out that, well, if you're borrowing from one-off items or drawing down on reserve or using money out of Scotland to make the sums add up every year, then it's a similar thing to borrowing money as the UK government does, to balance its budget every year. So it's building on a number of years of these sorts of one-off pots being used to balance the budget. You discussed it at length in the previous session about the use of the ScotWind as a further kind of fiscal management tool, where the government are saying at the start of a year, particularly the years they've been under pressure, we will use 600 million from Scotland, but then maybe a UK budget in the middle of the year means consequentials are generated, which they haven't had to use it in the end. Now, Professor Roy in the previous session said, this is an appropriate use of it. I think if the policy goal of the Scotland Fund was to spend money on capital to, pump prime the energy transition and make things happen on infrastructure so that we can, grab the kind of slightly diminishing opportunity at the moment, actually, for making the most of that economic opportunity, then it's understandable that they would want to use it for a fiscal management tool, but that's an opportunity cost that we're not investing that money in the energy transition. So whilst it's understandable, it doesn't really fit with the policy goals of what Scotland's about.
Okay, thank you. Professor Heald, I was interested in the bit which I think is related to this about AME and DEL and how the Scotland's social security budget is kind of impacting the government differently from what it does at the UK level. Could you just explain what you mean and by that term quasi-DEL?
Oh, well, it was a term I invented for the purpose of that memorandum. But the basic point is that if the UK government overspends on social security, which is outside Barnet, if it overspends on social security, the Treasury will fund it. But the problem is that particularly when Scotland's got social security benefits which are not matched by positive block grant adjustments, it's got to be a charge on the rest of the Scottish budget. So basically, that was my concern was that you get an erosion of the rest of the Scottish budget because of the higher claims from social security, which are kind of often unpredictable and actually create pressures for short-run changes. But the more general point is the Scottish budget's now got a lot of demand-led items within it. Things that, where you've got expenditure you can control by setting hard limits on delivery organisations, that's one thing. But where you have demand-led items where once you've set the rules, you've no control of how much is spent. It depends on how many people claim those benefits and are successful, unless you then change the rules. But as we very much discovered from the UK experience recently, withdrawing benefits that people have is politically extremely difficult. So I think there is a real problem with the Scottish budget. My view is that there's a paradox. The whole idea of getting devolved taxes was to give the Parliament more legitimacy. But the outcome of that, it might be more legitimacy, but there's also actually substantially more risk. I mean, the talk about in the previous session, the swings you can get in the reconciliation because of the relationship between UK changes and Scottish changes are really quite large in terms of, for example, borrowing powers and the rules about the reserve. So if you're going to have this system, I think Scotland needs a bigger reserve capability and more borrowing powers. The problem is the relationship between the Scottish Government and the UK Government is not good, and the UK Government will probably be very reluctant to extend the borrowing powers.
So I mean, do you think we were mistaken to take on some of these powers?
No, I think there was less care about social security than was desirable. One of the problems is it's very difficult for the Scottish Government to actually be less generous than the UK system. So you get the problem. The whole point of devolution is to allow different policy choices. But you can't, when you're working within a broadly fixed budget, you can't spend more on everything than the rest of the UK, than the UK or England, as the case might be. So basically, you're finding that some of the Scottish budget that should be for health spending and school spending and other transport spending and other things is going into social security. And that is a kind of spending which is very difficult to control once you've actually set the rules and eligibility.
Okay. I mean, if either of the other want to come in on that point, you're welcome. Professor Bell, I'll come back to yourself. Oh, Professor Spouch first.
Just to say, I mean, this is a mixture of issues around unpredictability of things like adult disability payment, which is obviously the replacement for PIP, and having benefits like they have in the rest of the UK, and I guess a devolved policy choice about how you then administer those and the sort of criteria you set around them, plus the decision to introduce a new benefit, particularly the Scottish Child Payment. So I guess these are, absolutely legitimate devolved policy choices given the powers the Scottish Parliament has, but it does introduce additional risk in terms of budget management because of the type of spending. I guess that's the point. And the more of your budget that's taken up by these types of spending, the less easy it is to sort of manage the risks around your budget.
I pretty much agree with all of that. In fact, I made a submission to the Social Security Committee, who asked me to help them with their input to the fiscal framework review, and exactly it was this Dell-Amy split that I concentrated on. I think very much this issue of demand-led programmes, along with the political costs of changing those programmes, and the principle or the reality that it is very difficult for the Scottish Government to be seen to be less generous than is the case for the UK Government. All hold true. The net effect of all of this is a very substantially increased risk to the Scottish budget, which you would think the most obvious way to remedy would be to increase its borrowing powers. But throughout my long discussions around the fiscal framework, it seems to me the Treasury has always been very resistant to a substantial increase in these powers. One thing that is, I think there is more activity around south of the border than there is up here, is around programmes to get people off benefits, and that is not necessarily a lose-win outcome. It can be a win-win outcome if these programmes are properly designed. But I think overall the net effect of these additional powers has been to substantially increase the risks to the Scottish budget.
So, well, can I come back? Can I ask something else, and then you can all come back in again if you want. So, I mean, given that level of risk, increased risk, our lack of borrowing powers, I mean, is there any point having a Scottish spending review because it's just so unpredictable?
Well, there is obviously the lack of borrowing powers means a lack of ability to smooth out and stick to a plan.
Yes.
And so, it seems I would not at all be surprised if the UK government doesn't again somehow or other try to change the way that PIP is run and eligibility for PIP. That will have a BGA implication, which in turn, given the size of the ADR budget, could have knock-on effects that could knock a spending review off course.
Okay, thanks. So, Professor Heald.
I was just going to come back to the point about the uncertainty created by the relationship between the UK budget and the Scottish budget. The classic one was the briefing that the UK government was going to reduce national insurance contributions for employees by 2% and actually put 2% on the basic rate. Put 2% on the basic rate of income tax. That would have cost the Scottish budget $1 billion extra in block grant adjustments. Now, that just shows how vulnerable the finances of devolved Scotland are to changes that are made at the UK level. Obviously, borrowing powers in that context, if that had gone ahead, would have been extremely valuable.
Okay, thanks all very much. I could go on longer, but stop.
Michael, to followed by Liz.
Thanks, Kavir. Can I start with the issue of transparency, probably most like comparability, Professor Spowage, something you've commented on, I think, in the aftermath of the budget, and you've heard the evidence we took in the first session regarding some of the changes to reporting against the autumn budget revisions and otherwise. Just your reflections on how you feel that's gone in terms of the transparency of the budget.
Yeah, there are all sorts of issues with the transparency of the budget this time. And whilst it's welcome to see some of the transfers that we are expecting to see every year in the ABR baselines, it remains a really difficult picture to actually figure out what's going on. And you know, you have particular issues with local government, I suppose, because of the interactions between that and the health budget with social care payments. We've not quite got to the bottom of it yet, and it's a week on, but almost there. Just understanding over the years how much money that's in the health and social care budget that the government has earmarked for social care and the uplifts in pay and social care that they then baselined into the local government general revenue grant every year, to understand whether they're actually putting more into this year than they were last year. And I still don't know the answer to that question a week on. So it's really difficult to see with both these regular transfers, but also these Scottish Government support for things in local government, that they then baseline different amounts of that into every year, which makes it very difficult to see on a like-for-like basis, the funding that's going to local government. And we have this sort of mad fight every year about whether it's gone up or down, and COSLA say this, and it's completely, it's not helpful, and it doesn't add to the debate around what priorities the government's actually spending money on. So fine, you've baselined some of the transfers. Let's baseline them all. Let's have this year's ABR, the last one, where these things are done, and the 27-28 budget presented with all of this money in local government that should be, all of this money in education for training doctors and nurses that should be, and let's stop this sort of immature nonsense of not just baselining these transfers, so we can all see on budget day what they're actually spending and whether it's gone up or down.
That's really useful. I mean, we seem to have taken a half step in that direction. Yes. But I was speaking at the University of Glasgow yesterday, and actually the anger amongst the stakeholders from various areas was actually quite palpable in terms of still a week on not understanding what their various sectors have in allocations in the budget. And this seems to be part of the problem. So we've been advocating for some of this to be done, but it's almost by taking a half step, it almost feels like it's perhaps a bit worse if you don't go the full distance and say this is the full picture. Do either other professors have any comments in this area? No, it's something that particularly animates Professor Spowage, and rightly so. Can I take into one specific example of that then on colleges? That was great play from the Cabinet Secretary on the day, claiming, I think it was £70 million. I've now heard a variety of different figures on that. It looks like it could have been 50. It's now down potentially to 40 when you take out the amount of money that was allocated to the only single capital project in the college estate in the last 7 years, or whatever it might be. That seems to be... Any clarity in the picture there? The claim that was made versus the reality?
Yeah, my understanding is that the 70 million was about the allocation last year compared to this year, and that the in-year transfer, I think it was for Fife College, wasn't included in that baseline. I mean, also it's important to look at the evolution of the college's budget over the last Parliament, I think, as well. We can't just look at how much it's gone up this year. I think, we would all probably agree there's been significant cuts to college budgets in recent years. So it's about the extent to which it gets you back to where you started, and also the increased costs that colleges are facing, like lots of parts of the public sector, because of employer national insurance and all of these other things that most of these organisations had to eat that increase within their budgets. So I'm sure the college sector will welcome the increase, and the fact that actually they were seen as a focus for priority in things like the budget speech, and that link between sort of getting people out of poverty and upskilling, which is obviously linked to the college sector.
£70 million, but if it now looks like it's £40 million within a week, that's a significant challenge. And of course, it's nowhere near meeting the 20% real terms reduction over in the last 5 years the Auditor General has set out. So is that £40 million figure accurate, as your understanding?
I mean, I've seen the commentary on that. You know, to be honest, I don't know. But you know, we should know.
Yeah.
This is the sort of thing that the government need to work hand in hand with the Parliament to reduce the confusion about this sort of thing, so that we're much clearer when they present their draft budget what they are spending money on.
Comments in this area? No, okay. Professor Heald, in your evidence earlier, to the convener, you said that a new government, or this government even, should stick to the current spending plans across the course of the year. But there's been significant commentary both from your colleague Professor Spowage and Fraser Valander and from the Institute for Fiscal Studies saying that we could anticipate there may have to be an in-year adjustment or another Scottish fiscal event within the year, which we've become quite used to. There's been 3 of them in the last 4 years, and it's my understanding an internal one last year rather than a public statement, partly because of this managing these pressures that you've been exploring. Do you not think that's a significant risk given the headwinds that the government faces and the fact they're relying essentially on something coming up within the year?
Yes, it's obviously a significant risk. The point I was making is that if public sector organisations get reasonable certainty about their funding, it's a much better climate in which to try and achieve efficiency savings. If people are not certain of what their funding is going to be, there's an awful lot of attention going to go on to marginal activities, including getting the money out the door as fast as possible, so there's not money there to be taken off you later in the budget year. It's not just the Scottish Government needs a greater degree of certainty about its funding, it's about all the organisations down the delivery chain that need better. I mean, I've thought for quite a long time that if the UK had kept regular 3-year spending reviews, it would have been a lot easier for the public sector to cope with the pressures on spend. But when you don't know what it is, what the future funding is going to be, and you get in-year reviews, that's particularly damaging, for example, in terms of how organisations are going to behave. And I think that's one of the lessons which has come out very clearly from recent experience, is the Parliament actually needs bigger borrowing powers.
Okay.
I mean, one of my concerns about this coming year and then next year is I mean, obviously 27-28 looks like it might be particularly challenging. Depends on the size of the reconciliation that was discussed in the previous session, of course, which we'll get confirmation of in the summer. But the issues around public sector pay are huge and were largely unacknowledged in the budgetary documents. There was an integrated pay and workforce plan, that might be the wrong name, but you get the document I mean, which restated the pay policy from the last budget, the 9% over 3 years. The detail of that is that there shouldn't be a 1 above 3% unless there's a clear commitment that it will be less than 3% in future years. And, I might be wrong, there might be one that's met it, but, the vast majority of pay deals that have been agreed have blown it up. And I don't think it is reasonable to think that people who have settled for 4% or whatever it is, and the resident doctors one was, when you look at the detail, was actually much larger than it appeared. That 1.1% that the SFC are assuming will have to be met if they were going to be in the sort of the parameters of that. I don't think it's anyone. Nobody could reasonably think that's going to happen. So they're going to present a new pay policy alongside the 27-28 budget. So for on pay, the sort of silence on the fact that the pay policy for the first couple of years has kind of been blown to bits. There's no acknowledgement of that, and it feels a bit like that can's been kicked down the road to the next budget. That's going to be a real pressure on pay. We know how much of the resource budget is taken up by pay, over half of it. So that's a concern, a huge concern, I think, for the next budget. And it does feel a bit like it's a problem kind of being shoved past the election a wee bit.
But the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said, Professor Bell, that they think it might not get to the autumn. Would you share that concern?
Well, yeah, it's possible. It depends on the reconciliation, various other things that may happen in the meantime. But I mean, in relation to the pay, which is another potential issue around having to have another fiscal event. Our earlier discussion around inflation, if price inflation doesn't ameliorate or drop, then you're going to get more pressure from those who are seeking to increase their wages, which potentially blows a hole in the whole 9% figure.
We've touched on the spending review a few times. Earlier on, the question, Professor Spowge, you said that the spending review of the UK government wasn't in control of the Scottish government, the timing of some of that, and they may have concerns about it. But that was published on June the 11th of last year. It took 14 months for the UK government to prepare that spending review. Was there any reason that a spending review could not have been undertaken in Scotland prior to the publication of that, at least in methodology, taking a zero-based approach? Yes, the global figures and conclusions of the UK in terms of what was allocated, but if you're building this from the ground up as a methodology, where are we getting value for our budget, what are we looking at? That's something that could have been done at that point, isn't it?
I'm sympathetic to that argument that work could have been ongoing, particularly if you're doing a zero-based review. The process that the UK government went through, asking departments, as I understand it, pretty tough choices about, the sort of, 20% of activity that they would drop if they must because of their budget, allocation and things like that. There was that sort of line by line looking through everything that was done. Yes, the Scottish Government could have kicked that off prior to the publication and the outcomes of the spending review, which, given the sort of overall envelopes were set at the previous budget by the UK Government, it was really about where do the departmental budgets fall. So the extent to which that allocation was really going to move hugely, it wasn't always. It was hard to know exactly, but I'm sympathetic that they could have been doing it in parallel, yes.
Witnesses feel that what we ended up with in the SSR is a satisfactory document in order to allow organisations throughout Scotland to be able to have sight of what they've got to do.
Well, I think Professor Roy was kind of clear that there are a lot of missing pieces, going down to the detail at the departmental level, and it's good that we have something out there, but I think there is potential for improvement.
Okay, Professor Hield.
It's very, very difficult because almost always you've got some election at some part of the United Kingdom. So you have a complicated relationship between spending cycle and the electoral cycle. The original, Gordon Brown's original idea about spending reviews is that it would take place at the beginning of a parliament, the UK Parliament. So I think that it would have been better if the timing had happened that the next Scottish Government did the spending review, but it was urgent to get forward figures. So yes, I mean, one of the things, there's a need for a fundamental review of the fiscal relationships between the devolved legislatures and the UK government.
Okay, our last question is relating to the mansion tax. I mean, any clarity as to where that money will accrue? I think it was a kind of slight half answer from Professor Roy.
Yeah, my understanding from rereading the parliamentary transcript and things like that is that it will be funding that will accrue to local government. There's a line in the budget that there's been £5 million allocated to do the valuations of the properties that are likely to be in those sorts of bands. And we don't know yet how much it will raise. It depends, obviously, on the rate that's set. Although I've seen that Ivan McKee's said some figures maybe around 14 million potentially. But my understanding is that will go into local government. But what we don't understand, obviously, those will only accrue at certain bits of the country, one would think, which will mean it'll have to how it will be pooled and then sort of impact on the general revenue grant. I guess is to be negotiated.
In essence, most of that will be generated, we think, probably in Edinburgh, a little bit in the surrounding areas, but that money won't be kept by Edinburgh. No. It'll go into the general and to be distributed around the country through the...
That would be my understanding of how it generally works, but we don't know that for sure.
Well, we can pick it up with the Cabinet Secretary, I'm sure.
But it's a huge missed opportunity to not do something more fundamental on council tax.
One or two questions for the Cabinet Secretary next week. Liz, to follow by Craig.
Thank you. I think you were in the room with the previous panel when I was asking about social security, and that was very much in relation to the concerns that this committee had had, that we weren't getting sufficient detail about the how that spend is increasing at such a rate when it comes to specific policies, and secondly, to try to find much better information about the effectiveness of the spend in social security. Is that something that concerns you as well?
Certainly concerns me. I spend quite a lot of time in the weeds of DWP and Scottish Social Security and various other websites looking for data, and at the moment I wouldn't say it's a data-free zone, but there could be a lot of improvement. And then, these are sort of general population level statistics, but there's also a need to kind of understand at the individual level what's happening, and you can only do that with survey work.
Would you be able to give some examples of data that you think is not there that would be very helpful?
One of my, I think I'm correct in this, I couldn't get much geographic, you do want very fine geographic detail that you can line up against, for example, census data. That's one, but that's one among, I think it stands out, but I think that's useful. You can certainly get that for DWP data.
Mm.
Yeah, for research to really understand the interactions between, things like labour market incentives with payments, I suppose particularly things like the Scottish Child Payment and other social security benefits, but also the interactions between someone who's receiving ADP and maybe their interactions with the health service, say, so we kind of understand conditions and looking for policies that would perhaps help people who are on particular sets of benefits. You really need to be looking at things like linked administrative data. There's been a lot of progress recently, including a new data set called RAPID that's coming on stream, which links up DWP and HMRC information. And there's quite a lot of support right now for researchers to be looking at that data and to think about how we could use it and what other data we could link to it. And there's a lot of potentially quite exciting developments for us to really understand the drivers behind some of these things. One of the issues, though, is quite often if we're talking about devolved social security benefits, they're not included because they're not collected by DWP. So I think this is going to become an increasing kind of blocker for us to understand what's going on for Scotland specifically.
When does this RAPID system come on stream?
So it's getting made available in the Secure Research Service very soon. There's applications out at the moment for fellowships to study it. So this is happening sort of now. But it doesn't include Scottish social security data, which is a limiter for us understanding the implications for Scotland. When you have tax and social security data and then potentially also health data on a linked data set, it allows you to create panels and to really understand why people are trying to get those causal links about why people are making different choices.
I think the challenge for this committee to examine the social security spend is what policies are making the biggest difference to the broad aims of the Scottish Government, and what policies are less important in that regard. That's the big challenge, because obviously we all want to achieve better outcomes in terms of social security delivery, but it's very difficult to do that just now because we don't have the relevant data. And that then begs the question, which this committee raised in its report, about examining universal payments. Because if you run the argument that we're spending too much on social security because we're not getting enough money in terms of revenue payments, there is a strong argument to examine universalism and what is effective and what's not effective. Is it your understanding, I don't want to comment on government policy, which I know you won't do, but is it your understanding that that debate is hampered because we don't have some of this detail?
I would say probably yes. I'm just thinking about the universal payments and what information that we do have and that we can utilise around you know, things like bus passes and so on, and how effective this is, and how much dead weight there is, in the sense that there are wealthy people who use these services who could afford them if there was a cost. It's, you know, again, it goes right back to the whole question about, do we want a progressive tax system? But there's also the sort of mirror image of that, in a way, through the benefits that people get, not necessarily counted as defined as benefits, but the universal payments.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very complex area, but nonetheless, I think it's a very important one, because, you know, there has been an exponential growth in social security spending. It's been rising, although I think there's some areas of improvement. It's been rising at a faster rate than it has, obviously, in other parts of the UK. And the driver has to be about the effectiveness of these policy commitments. And I think at the moment it's quite hard to come to conclusions about what is working well. For example, there is some evidence that the Scottish Child Payment has been working well. There are, just as you have said, Professor Bell, there are other areas where people who are well off and can well afford some of the benefits, or the universal payments, I should say, don't actually need them. And that's quite a challenge, I think, to try to make social policy, economic policy, more effective.
Partly, it goes back to data and understanding how this kind of spectrum of different government support actually enables you to achieve the objectives that the government has set. Quite a lot of it, you know, is about trying to understand people's circumstances and how they feel about the circumstances that they're in. And although the administrative data is good at giving you the facts about how much people are getting or how much they're paying in, there's also the need to understand how people feel about the way that they're being treated by the state in relation to these payments.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Craig, to be followed by Patrick.
Thank you, Convener. Just to pick up the point about the Scottish Government and increasing its borrowing capacity, isn't there a risk, just as we've seen in relation to the additional funds that have flowed to the Scottish Government, which was at £155 million for the removal of the two-child benefit cap, which I think equates to an extra £126 million, that as that money came into the Scottish Government, they then said, well, that's more than we're expecting, so we'll spend that additionally on tackling child poverty, not on cutting tax or putting those funds elsewhere. So isn't there a risk that, in terms of the way in which the Scottish Government is approaching public expenditure, is that if we were to significantly increase their borrowing capacity, rather than looking at their budget, they would just utilise that, and rather than basically going cold turkey, they would just continue to spend in a way that they presently are?
There's obviously going to be political choices about the level of spending and the level of tax, and people will come to different views about that. My point was that the level of interconnection between what happens at the UK level and what happens at the Scottish level is now become intensified with the movement to devolve taxes, particularly income tax. I mean, one of the points we've made in the previous session is a lot of attention was actually played not to the substance of spending, but actually to the way that the fiscal framework was working. And so I think that to make the existing system work, the Scottish Government is going to need more borrowing powers. Clearly, the UK Government is not going to give the Scottish Parliament unlimited borrowing powers. But when you get things like a 500 million swing in the reconciliation payment, that is just massive in relation to what choices the government's got on the margin.
Yeah, Professor Spurge.
Yeah, in terms of the I guess it's probably more fiscal flexibilities are required, potentially, given the level of risk that the Scottish budget is open to. So the limit on the reserve, you know, that's a fiscal flexibility that could be relaxed without much risk to anybody. You know, it's just that so that there's a larger bank account the government can put money into, so that it can then draw down upon. For example, if there's big unexpected consequentials in the middle of a financial year, the more space it has in the reserve, the more incentive it has to pop that in the reserve and then keep it for next year if there's something coming down the line like a big reconciliation. And it depends, if there is resource borrowing powers, which there are at the moment for forecast error, you know, there's a cap on that. So why is the cap there? One. And why is it set at the level it is, given the level of risk that, you know, there could well be an £800 million reconciliation. The chances of it look to be lessened, but there could be. But that's above the limit that they're allowed to borrow for forecast error. So I think resource borrowing because the government has a policy priority is one thing. Resource borrowing due to forecast error, I think, is another thing. And I think there are legitimate questions about why there's a cap on that at all, and why the cap's set at the level it is when a reconciliation of more than £600 million is eminently possible that the government will have to deal with.
And is there no way that the government could just build in more headroom in itself year on year in terms of the way it approaches its budget, using the reserve, for example? So, wouldn't that be a more prudent way to approach it? I accept, just for a moment, I think what a couple of my colleagues said was, well, the UK government's hardly got a good reputation in terms of its borrowing levels either. The assumption being that for a devolved parliament, that the Treasury borrows on behalf of the whole of the UK. And in some tough years, some of the real terms increases the Scottish budget have emanated from increased borrowing. Treasury level.
Certainly have been funded by UK-wide borrowing, and we do need to remember that, and that's one of the reasons for the large direct consequentials that we've seen in the last couple of years, increased borrowing by the UK government, so they're spending more, so that flows through into Scotland. But you could make an argument that the government could have left the money in the reserve that they've taken out this time. They could have done that. But I have no doubt that politically they'd be criticised for that. Also, you're not using all the powers at your disposal to spend, to avoid having to cut spending or other things. So these are political choices that the government are making. But, to be fair to the government, they would absolutely be criticised for that. I have no doubt.
But in the same way, you get a bad credit rating if you fully utilise all your credit cards. The Scottish Government, if it fully utilises its borrowing or pulls the Scotland money down, I won't get the credit rating argument. To turn to local government, the Finance Secretary said last week that she was delivering 2% in real terms comparing budget to budget, describing that as a settlement that is fair and which recognises the important role of local government. And she said this is a reasonable deal given the cost of living pressures, and she urged local authorities to translate this reasonable settlement into reasonable decisions on council tax. Having been able to interrogate those numbers further, do you think that's a reasonable deal for Scottish local government, and should it mitigate against above inflationary increases in council tax if councils are then to meet their statutory obligations?
But I think you can see from commentaries from councils that it's unlikely to be sufficient to avoid, probably fairly large, at least high single-digit increases in council tax. Council budgets, as we know, have been under significant pressure for years, and they have overall, formed a smaller proportion of the Scottish Government's budget over the years. It is a 0.4% real terms increase if you take account of the in-year transfers, which one should. That's what the Scottish Fiscal Commission have said. So it's a very small real terms increase in the local government budget. And as I said, it looks to have baselined quite a lot of previous transfers that the government have made to cover things like an insistence that social care workers are paid at a certain level. So these sorts of baseline payments can look like the budget's going up when actually it's money that's going to local government to pay for a particular thing that the Scottish Government have insisted upon. That's why this can be so difficult to kind of unpick what the underlying position is. But I think, local government budgets are under huge pressure. The social care part of it in particular are under pressure. We know that schools are under pressure. I think that we're going to see some pretty big increases in council tax because they're under such pressure.
And just to close on capital, obviously I think you've identified it, or Fraser Van's identified in some of the blogs, in respect of the projections for capital expenditure. Obviously, the UK budget was front-loaded. We're seeing the Scottish capital budget falling in future years. There's now this distinction in the infrastructure delivery pipeline 2026 strategy, of a distinction apparently between delivery and development. Post-election, those some vital projects, is there a risk they just wither on the vine in the early years of a parliament when the electorate are looking elsewhere, because they're now categorised as in a development pipeline rather than a delivery pipeline?
I mean, I think what we would generally expect to see from a capital spending review is a programme of work which has times and costs, and, you know, this is when this is going to start and this is when this is going to finish, and this is a long way from that. So I think what I would like to see is an actual plan, and actual what we would expect from a capital spending review, which is this is you know, this is what we're going to spend on each of these projects. This is when they'll start. You know, so that people can actually have an expectation over when these things are going to be delivered, and how much the government thinks they're going to cost at this stage, and perhaps some more commentary on how they're going to cope if costs overrun. Because with all capital projects that the public sector set out, there's quite often an optimism bias both on timing and on cost, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Aye, indeed. I'm tempted to say Hinkley Point and HS2, but I won't. Patrick.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd mostly like to ask about local government, but I just wanted to pick up on one of the early questions from the convener right at the start, actually, about the references to the proportion of people who, in government commissioned research, say they feel they understood the UK tax system or the Scottish devolved tax system. Do we have any reliable data on the proportion of people who accurately understand those systems?
I mean, I saw those figures some time ago, and I just don't believe them at all. I mean, they're just incredible. I mean, I was in a meeting with with a really serious tax expert who said, "Well, I don't understand it, and that's my living." So the UK system is enormously complicated. A witness in the previous session made the point about, I think it was about 190 kinds of exemptions and allowances.
I'm not suggesting that we should expect, you know, a huge proportion of the public to have a very highly detailed and technical understanding, but there are some broad brush misunderstandings that I think are very common. I've certainly seen in my inbox people very angry saying, I'm on a below average wage and I'm paying the higher rate tax. You know, people who may simply have read a Daily Mail headline or a political advert on Facebook. Do we have any understanding of to what extent people have a broadly accurate understanding as opposed to profound misunderstanding?
I don't know, but I would suspect that public understanding is very low. I think if public understanding was high, the governments wouldn't get away with fiscal drag in the way that they do. They wouldn't get away with the confusion between what happens to tax rates and tax bands.
Okay.
The UK government has been getting onto sticky wickets about whether it's kept its pre-election promises. The question that, in my view, fiscal drag breaks the spirit of those pre-election promises. It might not. People might argue it doesn't break the letter.
I mean, I had many casual conversations with people who would probably spend a very little, devote a very small part of their time to trying to figure out what's going on in the UK and Scottish tax systems, and I think the general level of knowledge of the system is extremely low. Obviously, the complexity is part of it, but there's just some lack of financial literacy, which maybe we should be putting more emphasis on in school. But as David says, our system is incredibly complex. That's the UK system, and then you add on all of the complexities associated with the way that the Scottish and Welsh budgets are dealt with, I'm not surprised that it's a very small proportion of people who fully understand it.
The other point is that when a lot of people argue for more devolved taxes, they seem to think that means the Scottish Government gets more money. And the Scottish Government only gets more money if the block grant, if the actual tax revenue is bigger than the block grant adjustment. Now, that is really quite difficult to explain to people.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, I think above and beyond the tax system, and you know, I've got teenage children who are getting quite a lot of financial literacy education. I'm a bit heartened about the next generation's understanding of the Scottish tax system, to be honest. Given my children tell me, but one of the things that people are very poor at often not understanding is the income distribution. And the fact that the distribution of taxpayers is different to the distribution of all income earners. Yeah. Households, individuals, it is complicated, but quite often people will think that they must get the average income, yes. Whatever they are. Yeah.
Both people on below and above.
Mostly
average.
above, to be honest. But you know, people are often quite surprised where these levels actually sit for median income for taxpayers, and then median income if you look at all households. It's often much lower than people expect. And I think that is an important thing. It's a thing we try to say all the time, but you know, the battle will never end, probably.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to come on to local government, and Professor Spowage, I think quite rightly acknowledged about 10 minutes ago, maybe a little more, that there's almost every year this kind of dispute between COSLA or local government representatives saying that the local government settlement is wildly inadequate and extremely unfair, and the Scottish Government saying it's very bountiful and generous and as fair as they can possibly make it, and the truth is usually somewhere in between. But it's not simple. It's a complex relationship to understand. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the long-term direction of travel has been really tough in terms of local government finances, and I'd like to ask for your view about where things stand. You know, if there isn't something changing fundamentally, you know, that there's been an attempt to broaden out the range of taxes that are given to local government, but not at the level that make a profound difference to their financial situation. There's been, you know, long-running debate about the failure to fundamentally reform council tax. And a persistent lack of political consensus on what to do about it, even though everybody understands that it's a broken system. And if there was to be a substantial increase over the longer term in the block grant that local councils get, that would have to come from national taxation, which, again, as I think David Bell said, if we wanted to make the tax system more progressive, the changes that are needed are at local level now, rather than further changes at national level. Would you agree with the suggestion, any of you, that if none of those things change fundamentally in the relatively near future, councils are going to be at risk of fundamentally breaching their statutory responsibilities in the foreseeable future? Never mind all of the additional things that people really want and need from their council services and from social care as well.
So, on the one hand, the fall in the fertility rate means that there probably will be fewer school kids going through in the future. Very difficult, actually, to reduce spending on education for schools education, but I think that's true. And as I said earlier on the other hand, social care, the demands on that will increase substantially. And it is also important to bear in mind that local government and budgets and health budgets are not independent of each other, that a lot of additional spending in health is actually because local government hasn't got the capacity to deal with people coming out of hospital looking for a place. Typically worldwide, I would say local government mainly relies on property-based taxes. Our equivalent is the council tax, which has been in need of revision for many, many years, but that's one thing. And also, in some countries, a proportion of sales taxes. That's really difficult to implement in our system, given that we found VAT too difficult to adopt at the Scottish level. So local sales taxes are probably not an option, but we're going for possibly the tourist tax, smaller, much smaller scale things, which I don't think will change the overall trajectory, which is what you're getting at, that local government under the current settlement will continue to probably have to more and more focus on its statutory duties.
And just to say, you know, whatever way you look at it, local government has become a smaller proportion of the government's budget, and that continues over the spending review period with real terms cuts going to local government, at the same time as they've been given the responsibility to deliver things that have been mandated by the Scottish Government. You know, the flexibility that they have to tailor services to the local area has been diminished over that period. So I do worry about the sustainability of the situation for local government. And if you talk to people who are working in social care, I think we should all be quite worried about that. And I do think there's a potential danger of them not managing to meet statutory obligations. And we can already see that to some extent in the housing side, you know, with housing and homelessness and the pressure that local government is under there. Given, as you said in the last session, I think, you know, a combination of different policy objectives at both the UK and Scottish level. So yeah, I think it's a real area for concern, and I think what the spending review highlights is the Scottish Government's decisions on things like social security and others that it's perfectly entitled to make, in the end mean that there is going to be a reduction in local government funding at a time of increased demand on their services.
I'm reading here a suggestion that of chief executives, leaders and directors of finance representing 81% of Scottish local authorities, 70% said they thought it was likely their council will be unable to balance its budget within the next 5 years. I mean, that's stark.
It's possible.
Any further comments?
5 years.
Could I just come back to a point you raised earlier? My view is that too much attention has been paid to minor taxes, and not enough attention has been paid to the taxes that generate serious money. That, for example, running Scottish income tax in a more sensible way, reform of non-domestic rates, reform of council tax. My view is there's nothing fundamentally wrong with council tax. It's the fact we use 1991 values. That's the problem. The longer it takes you to go to revaluation, the more there's going to be a relative change. Certain parts of Scotland are going to do well, certain parts of Scotland are going to do badly. That makes it politically extremely difficult. And there's a Scottish Government council tax consultation which closes at the end of this month. Sure. But one of the fundamental issues is whether that revaluation is intended to be revenue neutral or whether it's intended to raise money. Yeah. Now, I think that it's going to be quite difficult. I've got mixed feelings on that because I think you probably could raise more money, but I think it would be much more politically difficult if people opposed to the revaluation actually say it's the Scottish Government is going to get more money out of us. So I think there's an argument for politically for saying it's revenue neutral, but clearly local government needs more money.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I mean, I think the analogy I would use about the tax system between UK and Scottish and the understanding is about the railways. You know, when a train doesn't arrive, people always blame ScotRail, but 2/3 of the time it's because of Network Rail. Anyway, just to wind up, I mean, there's a lot of areas we haven't covered, but time is against us. But I'm just wondering if our guests have any area that they wish to comment on that we haven't touched on, if there's anything salient.
I just wanted to say quickly, I thought it was interesting the framing in the speech by the Cabinet Secretary about the two-child limit removal and the reinvesting that money in the priority of child poverty. Just to say, alongside the budget, there was little detail of exactly how that money had been allocated, and there's been further communication. Another news release came out on Friday saying a bit more about that. And so she talked about the additional payment for children under 1, or the top up to the payment, and also some stuff around, there was just things like breakfast clubs and other things that were sort of talked about. But just to say, within that money, it seems when the news release on Friday has included the statutory uprating of the Scottish Child Payment for everybody, which is statutory, and so it sort of implies that it wouldn't have happened anyway. So this is again another point about transparency. I don't think it's particularly helpful for this to be presented as if this has been spent on new stuff to deal with child poverty, when some of that money is allocated to a statutory uprating that would have kind of happened anyway. So it may be something the committee wishes to explore with the...
Okay, thank you for that. Professor Bell?
Just one thing we haven't discussed, which Graham Roy spoke about, and I'm completely confused about, is how we're going to account for the savings and the 1.5 billion over the spending review period, 384 million of which is supposed to be happening next fiscal year, and in particular how the NHS savings, which are the majority of those, how are we going to understand in what sense these savings have been realised? Okay, and Professor Heald, we started with you and we'll finish with you.
Nothing to add.
Okay, well, that's fine. That's great. We'll short, sharp and to the point. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for your evidence today. I'm just going to call a 2-minute break to allow our witnesses and official report broadcasting to leave, and then we'll go into a very, very brief private session.